Hey everybody, it is Jack Murphy and we are back on the Jack Murphy Live podcast, and today my guest is somebody that I've been wanting to talk to for quite some time. I've been reading all of his work quite in-depthly. Even in the last few days I've just been neck deep in articles and bylines from this man, of which there are many all over the place, and all over the place sort of intellectually it felt like to me too, which is one reason why I wanted to talk to him. His name is Sam Hammonds, and he is the director of poverty and welfare at the Niskanen Center here in Washington, D.C. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
Oh, I really appreciate it. And maybe if you could just give a little bit of a background to the listeners, just a real brief sort of introduction, because I didn't really know too much about you until I discovered you through the China shock syndrome or China shock doctrine article that we're going to talk a lot about. So part of the thing I like to do is bring maybe some new people to my audience. And so if you could just give a couple minutes background on where you came from, just a little bit on your education, and then we can just jump right into it.
Sure. I mean, I grew up in Canada as a quintessentially very online, nerdy kid living in rural fishing communities.
No kidding.
Given just the nature of my interests in politics and philosophy and stuff like that, you find a space on the internet to have the discussions that you might not be able to get in your backyard.
Absolutely. When you say very online, what do you mean by that? Because I got that sense from reading your Twitter for sure, because you definitely throw in little bits and pieces in there that indicate that you've been online and around for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 28, but I've been online since 98 probably.
Right.
I think my Newgrounds account's from like 1999 and my Twitter account's 2007.
Nice.
Early chat rooms, MIRC and Stickcam, the old video chat sites.
Yeah.
YouTube. I used to have a cringy YouTube channel to debate philosophy and stuff like that.
Did you have to delete it to get this job here in this fancy office?
No, there was nothing bad on it. It was just, when your voice is still cracking and you're like debating the ontological argument for God or something like that. It's like,
right.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe just wait just a minute longer
before
you tackle those issues.
Yeah. So, from there I went to school in Nova Scotia, St. Mary's University, studied econ, then went off to Ottawa, Carleton University to do a master's. At the same time, from a very young age, I, wanted to work in policy, but specifically American policy. And I think this is actually a general cultural thing in Canada, is we're all kind of America watchers to some degree or another. And DC itself always felt like a kind of, like an Athenian or like Roman, like classical city. It not just by appearances, but the kind of density of intellectual debate, and America as well. My perspective was always felt like a higher variance country, and by that I mean there's high highs, low lows. There's not a lot of social consensus, and there's a feeling of, even if the politics is typified by gridlock, that it could be another civil war, or we could be could have a renaissance. It's always like,
right.
Whereas in Canada things work very well, but it's very consensus driven. It's actually something I think America should try to emulate, because it does lead to good outcomes. But if you are in the world of policy and debate and philosophy, you sort of feel like there's the end of history has come and you're not much to do anymore. So.
The end of history.
Right.
I thought we put an end to that, actually. End to the end of history, or is that still a thing?
I think history branched off, and Canada is still pretty knows what it wants and is working pretty well. And I've also when I was a youngin', and I was big into Christopher Hitchens and those kind of people, and sort of had a level of romanticism for the life of like a public intellectual, right? And but not just that, but like someone who's like actually like changing things, not just scribbling. And so and I was also a very early big fan of libertarian writing and sort of the political philosophy of liberalism, and also rationalism. kind of less wrong kind of overcoming bias kind of community. And I was always fascinated by George Mason University in particular, and wanted to go there, and not necessarily for the education, but to be around that milieu of sort of the intersection of libertarian thinkers and like rationalist thinkers who were like actually, sort of like stepping outside of history and studying it like an anthropologist or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so after I got my master's at Carleton, I came and did a second master's at George Mason. Worked at the Niskanen Center, which is a research center attached to the school, and just sort of dove headlong into public policy, and unfortunately got hired at Niskanen. The Niskanen Center is we're kind of like, people use a lot of words today. We describe ourselves as moderate, but it's more like it's not a split the difference Howard Schultz kind of moderate. It's we take from different buckets, right? So there may be some things that I think AOC is right on, and some things I think Mike Lee is right on, right? And so,
so it's a heterodox, right?
Heterodox, or kind of you could say bipolar, and specifically like our history of the Niskanen Center is our founder Jerry Taylor was at the Cato Institute for 23 odd years or something like that. Was a vice president by the end of it, and ran the energy and climate shop. He would be the kind of figurehead to go on Stossel or Fox News and debate climate change activists. But over that time, he had a sort of road to Damascus moment where he realized he was sort of had become captured by his own filter bubble, and that the evidence for climate change was real. And so we are initially founded as a kind of break off from the Cato Institute. Jerry left, brought some people over. So we initially were like we were like libertarian Republican climate realists. But since then, we've sort of expanded to be heterodox in a number of areas. So, when I was hired, it was partly because I had done a lot of writing on like the normative foundations of the welfare state, and why, in some ways, a effectively designed welfare state is conducive to economic dynamism and the free market, and that sort of hit a sweet spot of like heterodox, where I was saying, where I came from. I have the pedigree to I have the bona fides as a like libertarian, but was deviating on an issue like the welfare state, because classically libertarians think that we should either taxation is theft, or we should just go back to some kind of like friendly society.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that attracted me to your writing was that I couldn't really nail you down, and so I would read and be like, "Oh, that's great." And then I'd read this other, and be like, "Well, I'm not sure that all jives." But in this world where I think, especially my audience and a lot of the people I talk to, we're sort of like in a post-libertarian world. A lot of us, at least in my sphere, I think once identified as libertarian. I myself went to George Mason too back in the 90s. And studied under some guys like Brian Kaplan, who's now a very prominent writer and professor there at George Mason. And so I was really indoctrinated into libertarian thinking. And I know a lot of my colleagues and associates were too, but I think that we've all sort of, I want to say, maybe matured out of that or evolved out of that. And I heard a critique thrown at some of my friends, like my friend Will Chamberlain, who runs Human Events, the website and long-standing conservative publication. They started calling us MAGA socialists, which is an interesting way of I think identifying the fact that we have begun to move beyond just strict libertarian understanding of the world, and are willing to entertain maybe like early Roosevelt sort of ideas on like how to marshal the economy and such in order to come to a greater good for everyone, but with leaving the libertarian doctrine behind. And so in reading your work, you definitely have the pedigree you have, and what I really enjoyed about your work, and we're going to get into it, is that you make your points, but then you also put it very heavily into context and very heavily into political history context, political science context, economic history and economic context. And you really draw very clear lines through the existing literature to come to the point that you're trying to make today. And the one piece that really stood out to me that I read of yours a while back, I guess it was late last year, was an article called the China Shock Doctrine. And what appealed to me very much about that was in my book, Democrat to Deplorable, I identified the Chinese ascension into the WTO and the battle for Seattle and the World Trade, the WTO protests and such as a really pivotal turning point for a lot of us who once had supported the democratic policies and democratic ideas, the neoliberal consensus, Washington consensus, etc. And then now, what is this? Man, 20 years later, we can look back at that moment and draw a straight line to here and see many of the negative consequences that we're experiencing as a nation, a culture, as an economy that gave birth to the Trump moment, the Trump movement. And so I really wanted to dig into that because in particular, you take a very sharp look at comparative advantage, for example, and that's something I'd like to discuss. And for my regular listeners, this one may be a little bit nerdier and a little bit wonkier than usual, but trust me, please stick with me. We're gonna tie it all together so that we can understand how it relates to our world today, because the main goal of the podcast is to try to help create a new mental model of the world, because for most of us, the models, the software that we were given as kids is just not functioning, right? We're just trying to process this new world, but the data is coming in and it's just we're not getting the right results. Right. So this is part of that exploration. So why don't we just get started right with the China shock thing? And can you maybe tell us a little bit about its genesis, why you decided to write it, and then we can just start working through, your thesis and the power of the grand strategy for China, which appears, at least from my perspective and that of some of my other guests, including John Robb, as to be a failed strategy, and one that wherever we engage in this grand strategy, we're creating more problems. So I'd love to hear your take on that. So why don't we just start with that, the China shock doctrine in national affairs, I think.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the genesis of it is, it's really a kind of spiritual follow-up to a piece I wrote for the Bulwark called The Cost of Trade of China. And the argument I was having there, I am philosophically a free trader. I think, globalization is good.
It should be pointed out that on the side of his eyewear, his glasses, it says globalist,
right?
Out there, which made me laugh when I walked in the door.
That's semi-ironic, but
yeah.
There's I think that the failure is really an elite failure, and a failure to communicate, right? So, one way of understanding elitism is not merely, every society has an elite, but if they are running the show and not communicating what they're doing to build buy-in, right? Then when promises don't come to fruition, there's a backlash. So originally I have another paper called The Free Market Welfare State, where I make the argument for social insurance programs as more compatible with a dynamic free market open economy. In part, one of the classic cases is something like the China shock, where, overnight, in a period of 3 years, we shed 2 million manufacturing jobs in a way that's very geographically concentrated.
Where was that concentrated?
Midwest and South Atlantic, furniture factories in North Carolina and stuff like that. And
right.
And in our models, in an econ model textbook, it's like, there's gains from trade, and it creates winners and losers, but the winners outnumber the losers, or at least you can redistribute. But we often don't do the redistribute part, right? Like we say, the pie will be bigger, and so in principle we can make everyone better off, but we don't actually follow up and do the in principle part. We don't.
Right.
And so there's some evidence that in European countries that underwent internationalization in the 90s, places like the Scandinavian countries had less of a populist backlash, in part because they had, robust reemployment programs, robust training programs, investments in supply chain to So for a displaced worker in one industry, you could move into a new industry that's even higher productivity. And we kind of only did half of that. So in a sense, we only got half the benefits of globalization, right? Like the benefits of globalization are one, that you have the comparative advantage that we're going to talk about trading with countries that have different specializations. But the other half of that is international competition puts pressure on your domestic companies to compete, to be internationally competitive, right? And that can be good for productivity because that will weed out the underperformers and reward the higher performers. And it's a concept called export discipline. When you're competing globally, you have more intense market discipline. But we only get half the benefits because instead of leveling up our firms, the export discipline just wiped out a lot of firms, right? And so you had this massive offshoring. So the first perspective was, we applied a kind of naive theory of globalization that was only captured half the benefits and also left a lot of workers behind because instead of retraining them or giving them any level of safety net, they fell into disability insurance or onto opiates or unemployment, or maybe they became a Walmart greeter, and that was an elite failure. So the piece I mentioned, The Cost of Trade of China, it sort of begins with this anecdote that the economist Danny Roderick has in one of his books, The Globalization Paradox, where when he was writing that book, it came out in 1999. He sent a draft to Paul Krugman, and Krugman read the draft and responded, Danny, I can't find any, technical problems with your arguments, but I feel if you put out this book that's critical of globalization, you are quote unquote giving ammunition to the barbarians, right? And I think that's highlights part of the elite perspective, which was, there's more nuance to trading globalization than we like to admit. But if we talk about it or if we make it overt, then we give ammunition to the barbarians who will oppose it. So we kind of have to give this simplified version of it for political reasons. And my view is that an economist's job is not to engage in strategic discourse, is to tell the truth about what economics policy does. So economists, especially in the 90s, went from being sort of analysts or experts into more advocates, right? And I think that's part of the initial elite backlash is we were sold a bill of goods, right?
So let's just back up for a second. So in the late 1990s, China wanted to obtain, a permanent normalized trade relation status with the United States. There was big debates about it. There was around the same time that we were working on NAFTA as well. And there was just a general stampede towards reducing barriers to trade, reducing barriers to capital flows across borders. And the third component of that is also reducing the barriers for people to move, right? So economic labor mobility is a really key component to...
And importantly, political integration, right?
Political integration.
So this is the distinction Danny Roderick gives between globalization and hyperglobalization, right? So you drop trade barriers, you drop tariffs on goods and services. That's globalization. There's nothing really wrong with that. But hyperglobalization is when you've picked all the low-hanging fruit of dropping tariffs. And now, to get more efficiency, you have to rectify the fact that American tea kettles and British tea kettles have different voltages, right? And so you end up having to, in some ways, merge your regulatory regime because the quote-unquote non-tariff barriers of how things are regulated, the kind of product standardization that a different country has, don't necessarily match between two countries. So if an American company wants to sell a tea kettle to someone in London, they have to have a separate product line, right? And that kind of hyperglobalization is what drove, these more supranational institutions like the European Union, where you have commissions that are set up to try to harmonize regulation across countries. And in the U.S. context, there really was in the late 90s an active program to harmonize North America and even Central and South America into these trading blocks, and there's arguments for and against that path, but it wasn't a path that anyone outside of the elite really consented to or even knew about. And to the extent that they knew about it, they had, they were listening to Alex Jones rant about the New World Order, and they're just like, they have this crazy vision of like Illuminati people sitting in their Freemason.
Which isn't too far from the truth, actually, given what you just described, in that you've got guys like Paul Krugman that don't want real information out to people so that they can't argue. And then we've also discussed how the true impact of free trade and globalization wasn't necessarily communicated to the masses. And then there weren't the safety, measures put into place. So it's not that far off.
There's a sense in which that, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there's a sense in which, the Alex Joneses of the world, what they believe is literally false, right? But it's capturing some element of truth, that at least something that's felt, right? And thinking that Pizzagate, thinking that Comet Pizza is home to a pedophile ring is obviously absurd. But then you get Jeffrey Epstein and Prince Andrew and the rest, and it's like, well, there's a sense of rot in the system at the top that's not wrong, but but the way it's being applied is like just not true. But then that ends up disqualifying you or discrediting you.
But in some senses, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but in some senses, it's rhetorically correct. But you're going to have a hard time persuading people of the nuances of global trade.
It's like when they said take Trump seriously, but not literally, right?
Yes.
There's a version of that, but the difference is these were open secrets. Like there was journals of economic integration. Judy Shelton, who is
sure, but they're open secrets, but there's a barrier of language and background knowledge and access to information, etc. It's there-ish if you understand it.
Right.
But it's, nobody went to Pennsylvania, did they? And said, we're going to let China into the WTO. And what that means is like all these towns around here, dead, gone. And guess what? We also have this idea that you're going to be just willing to up and move to wherever the new good job is somewhere. But that we know that's actually not true either. So basically you're going to stay and all the jobs and the money are going to leave. And then all of a sudden, you're going to be suffering from deaths of despair, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, et cetera, et cetera. And how you guys down with that? Like nobody went and did that. So there's like an opacity between, so it's not, you say it's open, but it's
no,
also
the knowledge is there to be found, like it as opposed to that these are all like hidden under the under the Smithsonian or something like that. Right?
Right. No, exactly. No, I get it, and I'm not a huge fan of Alex Jones by any means, and it is interesting how the Pizzagate stuff did sort of presage the Epstein revelations, or maybe that's what they were talking about in the first place. I absolutely have no idea. I was just at Comet Pizza the other day. I go there with my kids. Great pizza. Love that place. Yeah. I love that place. But back to the China thing. So the United States, and I remember even we were looking at the free trade area of the Americas back then, but that died with 9/11, right? Like the whole focus on
you used to be able to go between Canada and the U.S. without a passport, like super easy.
Right. They wanted you to be able to do that all the way down to the tip of Chile,
there's a world where that isn't like ultimately, and I'll put my cards on the table. I think that's actually a world worth moving to directionally, right? It's just that there's a pace of change. There's the level of buy-in and communication with the public. And this is why I sort of, and this relates to how I write, right? I like you mentioned, I try to embed what I'm writing about, or the points I'm trying to make, in some kind of historical flow. Try to like retrace the dialectic that led up to where we are now, and I think that also should inform the way we do policy, where instead of trying to stand outside history and take a God's eye view as if we have like some skyhook to the moral foundations of the universe and prescribe what should happen. Like these things are evolutionary, and in a way, the elite failure, and I get into this sort of in the final section of the China shock doctrine, was sort of applying a theory that was vastly removed from practice, right? And the bigger that gap is, so there's a theoretical case that we should have, a global common market,
Right.
and there's a way of getting there. It might take a century, but it, the Kantian arguments about like perpetual peace, like there's a lot of truth to that stuff. Like it would be great for China and for the rest of the world to be as rich as us, for us to all be peaceable and to trade and to travel the world, but that like we can't force that.
Isn't there a presupposition in that statement that every culture and society wants to be, at the end of the day, peaceful and coexist with everybody? Is that, I don't know if that's true or not, but isn't there an assumption built into there? And then wouldn't sort of history say otherwise? And wouldn't looking at primates and other animals close to us, wouldn't that say otherwise? That conflict and violence and resource competition, that sort of thing, is sort of innate in us, and we're prone to it.
Yeah, but it's the stuff of civilization, right? Like and I think this is also like part of the psychological subtext to a statement like ammunition to the barbarians. Like there really is like this figurative but almost literal dichotomy between us, the civilized, and them, the barbarians. But I think that constructing a civilization is all about taming those instincts, and channeling them in productive ways, and while also preserving human particularity. And this is why maybe even in that fully globalized world, you would still want to have a lot of heterogeneity, because one of the bigger it used to be the left critique of globalization was we're homogenizing the world, right? You travel to Tyson's Corner and then you go to Johannesburg and they look like the same place.
Yeah, I mean, have you been to Singapore lately? I mean, I was so bored out of my mind there because it was just like a combination of Miami and New York and something else. We had to seek out the novelty there because it was just, it's the same. And you can go anywhere in the world now. And I used to call it the Johnny Walker Black Index.
Right.
You can get Johnny Walker Black anywhere, and you can gauge the economic strength of the country based on how much that drink costs, right?
At the same time, if you're in Paris, McDonald's probably has the best French fries. So it's not all bad.
True.
There's just a balance, right? And maybe being a Canadian, I have a more nuanced perspective on it. Like I'm not. So like, there's a famous book in Canada by George Grant called "Lament of a Nation." He was writing, a conservative writer in the Red Tory tradition, which are sort of like big government conservatives, and we would today call it like a conservative populist nationalism. And Lament of a Nation is like this prediction that because America is so big relative to Canada, that our culture is going to be subsumed, right? Yeah. And that's why Canada, to this day has content requirements where the radio station has to play, 16% of the plays have to be Justin Bieber because he's happened to be born in Canada. Oh, right. And even now, like Justin Trudeau is talking about how to enforce content requirements on streaming companies like Netflix, and the pure anarchist, anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, globalist economist would say that that's so inefficient. Like if we all want to watch the Kardashians, we should just all watch the Kardashians. But there really is a trade-off, right? And as a small L liberal, I believe in pluralism, right? And pluralism is sort of the inverse of homogenization, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe there are economic quote unquote efficiency costs to Canada having some level of cultural protectionism, right? But maybe that is also essential to having a broader buy-in, and also it's one thing if we're buying TVs from Mexico, it's another thing if we're buying Mexican TV shows, right?
Well, that brings up so many interesting points. I came across an article you did in Quillette a few years ago, referencing happiness hypothesis and Jonathan Haidt. And, basically he says that we're 90% this giant elephant running through the streets, 10% this little rider bouncing up on top, hoping and praying we can just guide the elephant to go where we want it to go. And when it does go where we want it to go, we're like, look, we did that, even though the elephant was going to go wherever he wanted to go. Anyway, and something that you had just said really triggered that for me, and I can't remember what it was because I was thinking about so many other things too on top of it when you start talking about sort of cultural rationing in Canada, and I was trying to think about how or why we may or may not want to do that in the United States. And is there a same argument to be made about cultural rationing, as it were, or protectionism that you made in Canada versus the United States? Is there an argument to be made for that?
But I wouldn't say the U.S. as a whole, right? Because the U.S. is a cultural hegemon. Like, we export Hollywood all around the world. America is the beacon for, like, America has a robust national cultural place in the world, and that's not going to go away. Like, everyone's subscribing to Disney Plus right now. But
I don't know. The biggest YouTube channel in the world, I think, is those Indian guys, isn't it?
No, it's PewDiePie. But
there's a big competition, right, between the two of them.
I think to the extent this applies to the States is the internal heterogeneity of the United States, right? So, like, and a lot of the cultural backlash, the culture wars in the U.S. is a kind of localized version of the same debate, where there's a sense in, like a religious community in Missouri, like, feels like they have absolutely no cultural leverage in the modern world because everything is dominated by New York and LA, right? And so that's also one of the forces behind the realignment, where they have they're adopting the old left's like globalization critique, not just on economics but also the level of cultural homogenization that's being that feels like it's being pushed down their throats because they have relatively limited market power, right? And consumers drive what Hollywood produces, right? Like Nike took the Betsy Ross flag off its shoe because Nike's customers are millennials. They're urban. They live in the city. They're not the same with like the example Tucker Carlson gave at the National Conservatives Conference, like the Oreo, the rainbow colored Oreo. He's like, well, if I don't want my kids to see LGBT stuff on their cookies, I can't go start my own Oreo company, right? So there's this sense on the right now that's reframing the culture war debate in terms of a kind of new left critique of globalization as homogenizing.
I'm going to jump ahead to my question that was like 10 pages down after we went through the whole thing, because we're on the subject now. And you wrote in there that there was, or maybe it was in a different piece, but you wrote that there was a difference between civil society and cultural identity. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that. Is there a meaningful difference? Does civil society come from our culture? Where does our culture come from? Do different populations have different ideas of what civil society should look like? Is that separate from their cultural identity? I think this is something that people are really grappling with right now. Right. It's like, where does our actual civil society come from? Does it come from our culture? Where does our culture come from? It comes from us. And who are we? We are the elephant.
Yeah, by civil society, I really mean like civic society, like the state, right? So I think the best way to get into this issue is to contrast the multicultural policies of Canada with the United States. So the United States has this self-identity as a melting pot, right? So multiculturalism in the U.S. context is really a kind of homogenized. It's really a kind of monoculture. Like it's about having black, brown, and every color person be represented, but we are all going to be pulled into one sort of one nation culture, and
so like the civic nationalist idea, right?
Well, I think this is sometimes called like one nation conservatism, right, or one nation culture. and that has its roots in the relative. The 13 colonies were diverse, but historically America was dominated by like this white Anglo-Saxon culture, to the point where
dominated. I mean, created by.
Yeah, literally created by.
Right. Okay. So let's not use. I think dominated. For a lot of my listeners, they'll hear that word "dominated" and be like, "That's a negative thing."
Well,
it's a product of.
But I mean, it's literally both. Like wasps were the elite.
Right.
They used to restrict Jews and Polish people and Catholics from going to their Ivy League school. So there was a level of actual.
I'm out on 2 of the 3 of those accounts there. So
right. So like, and because America had this, the Scots Irish, for example, they are. If you ever read like Albion Seed, that book, they were the first sort of ethnic white population to lose the hyphen, right? They just became white, right? And then over time, the Irish and the Polish and Italian immigrants, like they all assimilate into sort of one identity, right? In Canada, it's a very different sort of policy. We have an official multicultural policy, but it's really a policy of accommodation, right? So, and this has roots in the fact that Canada was settled both by the English, but also by the Acadian French, and to this, within our lifetimes, Quebec has tried to separate from Canada, and they really are a nation within a country, right? So we can't have a one nation policy or one culture policy in Canada. We from day one we were bifurcated because there was genuine cultural differences, and both sides didn't want to assimilate to the other, right? And so that led to a kind of pluralism that was ingrained in our system, our federal system, right? And this ended up being extrapolated to our immigration policy as well. So,
Wait, how does that mean? And first of all, just a reminder. I mean, it quote worked, except for the fact that the Quebecois tried to secede from Canada twice, right?
Yeah,
so had they succeeded, did it really work?
Well,
no, it would have failed.
This is one of the another difference between Canada and the U.S. Like the history of secession in the United States is so tinged with states' rights and racism and slavery, in the way it's not in Canada, and so there is like this, the Albert Hirschman exit, voice, and loyalty sort of theory, where like there's different ways you can influence an organization. You can have voice in it. You can be democratic and put your opinions out there, or you can threaten exit. You can stop buying a product because you don't like what they're doing. And exit is a really important part of what keeps a country responsive, right? Like, and so yes, there's a alternative world where Quebec left, and we'd had like a Brexit, and Canada would be literally divided in half. But in some way, like the optimal is to have that active threat of like a viable, like real threat of exit that never actually gets enacted, because just having that threat enforces a level of federalism and pluralism and negotiation that keeps the system sort of responsive to those deeper things. And to explain how this affects our immigration policies, Canada has an explicit accommodationist policy about immigration. So, our view is not that new immigrants have to assimilate in a very deep sense to Canadian culture. We instead of having a melting pot, sometimes it's called the mosaic, right? We have genuine multiculturalism in a sense, where your local ethnic identity is you're Canadian, but you're also Hindu, right? Like you have the hyphen. We don't have an ideology of dropping the hyphen. And the Canadian part of the identity is less thick. It's more about your civic involvement, more about if you can participate in democracy and to participate in the state. So, one of the biggest sort of turning points on this was in the late 90s when Canada has a large Sikh population, and a Sikh man wanted to join the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the RCMP is kind of like our federal police. And the RCMP traditionally wear red with these funny hats, and obviously Sikhs wear turbans. And so the question was, can a Sikh join the RCMP? And if so, are we going to force him to remove his turban? And so this created a big controversy at the time. And the conclusion was, no, we have to accommodate that, right? And that actually leads to better integration in the long run, right? So if you force assimilation as your policy, then you actually get resistance. But if you're focused more on civic integration, then people from different backgrounds and communities and cultural identities feel comfortable coming out of their home, coming out of their community, joining in civil society, because they don't feel like they don't have to give up their cultural identity to do that.
Well, and what is it here in the United States?
I think here in the United States, there's more an ideology of cultural assimilation.
Really?
And I think it's derivative of that Anglo-Saxon Protestant sort of philosophy, more universalistic philosophy. I think it's also reflected in the way the cultural left has become very intolerant of intolerance, right? Like whereas in Canada, one of the funny coalitions that's formed, the Canadian Conservative Party has a very large immigrant constituency, in part for very obvious reasons. Like if you're a Christian and support more traditional family values, you have a lot in common with the Indonesian immigrant who just got off the boat and doesn't, they don't understand any of this social justice stuff, and so you end up having these odd bedfellows where, like, for example, when Ontario was trying to pass a very progressive sex ed curriculum, you had Christian conservatives and the immigrant community joining forces on that, and the solution is accommodation. We have to have genuine pluralism, and genuine pluralism, is based on the fact that, or based on the premise that, even if you think there's a right answer, and we all have our own comprehensive moral views about what the right answer is. You can't impose that. You can't, because imposing that is a kind of domination, right?
Right. So basically what you're saying is the civic society there gets made up from whoever shows up on the boat, right? No, you have to accommodate all of these views and you have to integrate all these new views. So basically it's like by numbers, right?
Well, that's what I mean by mosaic, right? If you stand back far enough from a mosaic, it looks like it's been blended together.
Yeah.
But that's quite different from literally, having a melting pot where everything becomes fondue.
Yeah. I'm grappling with that one a little bit because it sounds like if there's a loud enough faction on any number of issues, they would become integrated into your civic society. I don't know that people in the United States are open-minded like that. Am I seeing this wrong?
Let me give you the counterexample. So this mosaic policy that I'm describing in Canada, the exception is Quebec, because Quebec has a very thick cultural identity, right? They are French, and they are Catholic, and they, even though since the 60s they've become very secular, they retain that kind of French, more rationalistic view of assimilation, right? Like the French policy of assimilation is kind of paralleled in Quebec, and in the last decade there was this initiative advanced by the Parti Québécois, which is the sort of more nationalist party in Quebec, that they call it the Values Charter. And if this had passed, it did pass, but it was struck down by our constitutional court. It would require it would ban religious garb of any kind in public places, right? And this was transparently a form of discrimination against Muslims who wear headdresses and so on, and that is the opposite of what I'm sort of describing. That's a forced form of sort of rationalistic assimilation And I've joked before that like, progressivism, the current mode of progressivism we're currently in, like it is a kind of version of that, right? Like, it's only a matter of time before Bill Maher is president and bans the burqa, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that trend to see how the cultural side of progressivism is of course alienating to a 6-year-old in Kentucky. It's also potentially very alienating to the Catholic family man who just moved here from Mexico, right? Like
Definitely.
right, and that is a kind of myopia that I think the left doesn't have, because they don't, because of this American Protestant assimilationist way of looking at the world, universalistic way of looking at the world. They don't see that it's a false dichotomy, right? Like you can accommodate people of more traditional family values, even if you yourself don't believe in them.
I'm digging through my notes here because you brought up something that I wanted to talk to you about too, and I promise we'll get back to the China thing because I think it's so important. But you made a connection between social justice activism and Protestantism. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think.
Can you explain that to me? Because as I wrote that down, I thought to myself, I don't understand this.
Well, I think I might be sort of out of my depth here, but there's a universalistic strain in Christianity, right? There's a more particularistic strain, like if you think Orthodox, but then there's also this more universalistic strain, which I think is even as America secularizes, is still part of the cultural presupposition of everything from culture policy to even the trade issues we're talking about. Is the sense of building the kingdom of God on earth, and this broader sort of cosmopolitan equality, and I think that is in ways downstream of a kind of white Anglo-Saxon form of Protestantism in a way that isn't. It's very uniquely American in that sense. Like, there's the cultural views are the way different countries in Europe see these things, or I think there's also a parallel here to why like a lot of the populist nationalist governments in Central Europe are also like the Polish Law and Justice Party. They're also a kind of Catholic nationalist party, because I think there's this sort of underlying Catholic Protestant war of religion that's kind of taking place in the subtext, even though we don't use those terms. But those are the kind of that's the genealogy of those ideas, even if we detach them from theology.
So WASPs equal SJWs. This is what I'm taking away from this. There's like a direct line you can draw. You think? Yeah,
like literally, like that's like the WASPs ran the Ivy Leagues, and that's emanating from the Ivy Leagues to the extent that it's envisioning this kind of universalistic social egalitarianism that gives license to a kind of evangelicalism, right? Like, and these parallels aren't to falsify or to negate those views. That's actually what the historical context is. Even something like the effective altruism movement.
I was going to bring that up as well.
John Gray, the writer and philosopher, he has a book called 7 Types of Atheism, where the whole point of that book is to say, let's not just have the new atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins define atheism. There's different ways to be an atheist and a non-believer. You can be into Spinoza, or you can be a Buddhist, and he identifies like secular humanism, right? The kind of new atheist creed as really a kind of monotheism that has dropped the label God, right? It's and it seeks converts, right? But it also it also is, you could be traced historically from, Augustus Comte or Comte. Comte was the first person to coin the word altruism, and this was part of the Enlightenment, where we are becoming enlightened, and we see that natural religion, or, natural science and philosophy have kind of refuted religion, and now we need to construct a new religion, right? And Comte called his religion altruism, and they literally would wear tunics that could only be buttoned up in the back, because then you'd have to have someone help you, right? And this sort of self-sacrificing mentality really is a kind of Christian morality. Like, you can read Nietzsche or Ayn Rand if you if you want confirmation of that.
Right.
And there's nothing, and that isn't invalidating. Maybe that that is the culture we have, and we kind of operate in that culture. But we can't. You're deluding yourself if you think the cultural presuppositions that you have just came from ex nihilo. No, they are deeply embedded in history, and this all circles back to why you can't force things. You have to take a more evolutionary approach, because these things evolve. Like everything today has some piece of the past in it.
It's fascinating. I mean, my audience would be no stranger to the notion that social justice warriors, or what the Claremont Institute is now calling multiculturalism, or identity politics, or whatever the case may be, that has a religious element to it for sure. In fact, we've been talking about that quite a bit.
It's been a great awakening, right? Like, America's had these great awakenings, these Protestant evangelical awakenings in its history, and today's it's the Great Awakening, and we're kind of missing the fact that It has the exact structure of past Great Awakenings. It came on very quickly, caught a lot of people off guard. It's very, very evangelical, and isn't wrapped up in all these sort of rituals and social rituals. And just because it is nominally secular, it's the exact same sort of sociological phenomenon.
Right. Well, and they operate in a similar way. And you said that they're seeking converts, and they also seek out to destroy apostates, of which one, that's what I am. I'm an apostate. That's a former Democrat. And
I want to reiterate that I'm not saying this is a polemic against
Sure.
social justice. You can make it the exact same genealogy, it'd be a different genealogy for everything, right? And I think what I'm really against is lack of self-awareness. Right?
Yeah, I think that we can definitely agree on that. I had a conversation with a philosopher and an evolutionary psychologist, Bo Weingard, from Hillsdale, I think. He was on, and we were talking about different populations having certain proclivities towards, or an appreciation for, different types of political organization or political structures. Do you think that there's any connection between our evolution as an animal and who we are, where we evolved, what sort of contained spheres we evolved in, and then what sort of political system that we can either appreciate or endure? And if there are those kind of differences, what happens when you put them together in the same place and then ask for us to integrate, or create a mosaic, or turn everybody into fondue?
No, absolutely. I think it's almost the essence of conservatism to say that human nature is a really binding constraint on society, and that's not to say we can't modulate or mediate human nature to produce civilizations that are productive and transcend, like, tribalism and stuff like that. But it is saying that, in the same way that your Xbox controller is shaped like your hand, right? We mold the institutions to our physical and psychological form. We can't mold the psychology to the institution.
Well, that's a very interesting point that you bring up. And you also, I'm going to tie in another concept I think I read of yours, something about a veto, and it made me think about an elite veto or something like that. It made me think of the tyranny of the minority, and what happens when the minority is a tyranny, and their ideas are actually trying to shape us in ways that don't conform to who we are, as human beings. And I think that that's one of the things that we're experiencing right now is there's been a takeover of our institutions, universities, media, technology, etc., by a minority of evangelicals who are seeking to reshape human behavior through the power of these institutions. So I do see that happening because I feel it.
I think something like that is happening. So there's a great new book out by Michael Lynn called The New Class War, right? And this is a big feature of his book because there's this sort of myth of America as a classless society, right? Like de Tocqueville, like we are purely meritocratic, and unlike the Indian caste system or the British class system, we have we have inequality, but we don't have class. And Lynn says, no, that's just malarkey, right?
Yeah.
Like the post New Deal era was the last great moment of sort of class compromise, where there were institutions like trade unions, robust civil society in the form of religious congregations that provided that channeled working class culture and economic attitudes into power, and it wasn't to dominate the elite, but to have some kind of settlement between them, because you're always going to have an elite. Even communist societies have a managerial elite, and the issue is that in the last 4 years, those institutions have crumbled because they were deemed to be a drag on efficiency, and in some sense, like unions can be a drag on efficiency. Having Disney buy up Fox and everything else. Like maybe it's more efficient to have one company that owns all the media, but it ends up
no.
Well, there are these things called returns to scale, right? Like and so there is a argument, but what it neglects is the role of power, right? And power doesn't appear anywhere in economic textbooks, but power does exist, and when those sort of New Deal era sort of institutions eroded, all that was left was sort of the existing power structure that was made up of people with higher education, the managerial class, the professional class, and they've kind of taken over the means of production in a way that I myself am totally socially liberal. To say the least. I am not a trad by any means, but you can if you take a more pluralistic perspective. And I think this is why genuine liberalism is hard, because real liberalism is pluralism, and not a kind of American style liberalism, which is like all you Christians are backward people and stuff like that. Like the real pluralism requires you to sort of step outside your ego and your own interests, and to recognize the ways in which different people believe different things. And while I might not believe in a God, other people do, and that God maybe informs their views on sexuality and other things. And it's not consistent with pluralism to say, no, haven't you read The God Delusion? There is no God. You have to,
Right. Right. But there are some things in which you cannot compromise, right? Like what is, I have some ideas. What would be something that you would not compromise on? Like for me, it would be the general framework of what does equality mean? Equality to me means equality of opportunity. To other people, that might mean equality of outcomes. And now those, to me, are completely at odds with each other.
But I think it's also a false dichotomy, right?
Is it?
Like I think well, not just a false dichotomy, but equality of outcome is kind of a bit of a straw man, just to be frank. Like I think that.
Tell me, lay it on me.
Like the kind of egalitarianism that we're, the pre-Rooseveltian sort of the New Deal style vision of egalitarianism isn't about equalizing, incomes across. It's really about this social power, right? So that's what the Scandinavian countries are more egalitarian, not because they have flatter income distributions, but because they have robust, collective bargaining that gives workers some say over how their economy runs, and And that distribution of power is, I think, what people are really striving, what people feel like they're lacking, not that, and it gets channeled into sort of concerns about purely economic inequality. But I think the economic inequality is a red herring. Like, to me, abstract wealth percentiles are less important than the kind of social and class equality that prevents, the construction of these parallel societies or caste systems. Like, imagine if India, I don't know what India's like inequality rate is, but imagine they had relative income equality, like relatively speaking, but they still had Brahmins and they still had untouchables. I think that's a bigger issue than whether Jeff Bezos has $1 trillion.
Right. I think I was thinking more along the lines of whatever philosophy is driving people to say things like, we have to have 50% women in tech and 50% women in this and half and half in this, and exact, racial breakdown for every employer.
So the way Michael Lind puts this in The New Class War is he says it's a byproduct of thinking we're a classless society. Because if we are a classless society, the only thing that's left is to ensure that that there's a relative,
it's bigotry. The only thing left that's holding people back is bigotry, right? I think you wrote that. Right.
And what ends up happening is you end up having, in the old days they used to call the WASP, elite in the North, and the New England elite, they used to call them the Brahmin elite as a kind of a tongue in cheek. But now it's literally becoming a Brahmin elite because you have actual, Brahmin Indians that are joining the elite, and they feel like they're very diverse, and maybe they even, play up their, the lack of white privilege, even though they just came from a country where they're at the very top of the caste system.
Right. So, but how do you make room for somebody at the table that believes that we have a classless system, and therefore the only thing standing in the way of income equality and wealth equality is outright bigotry and sexism and misogyny? Like, why is there a place at the table for that kind of person? How did that person get integrated in the way that you described that they may be integrated into Canada? Is that something that we should integrate into the United States, general policies on life? Is that, no, we don't have a class, we have no classes, and the only thing standing in the way of upward mobility and achievement is racism, and it's the white guy's fault, and we need to ruin the white guy and take away his power, and the source of his power is his masculine energy, etc. I
think affirmative action is different from the kind of integration I was referring to before. Like, the kind of integration that really is important to social stability is like it's intersectional, if I can coin a term.
Ears are burning.
It's the intersection of race and class, right? So there's a big difference if you have a wave of immigration, a bunch of Italians come to America, and they're all stuck in a lower class under wage jobs that breed stereotypes about what Italians are like, versus a system where you have some cross-cutting of race and class, such that you don't end up having end up having a white working class that ends up identifying their cause as a white identity cause rather than as a class cause that might have some overlap with what Black and Hispanic working class people are facing.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's the broad coalition that wins moving forward, is the one that
I totally agree.
Understands that. However, I can't blame the white working class, and I hate that term actually, because in my research, especially the people that once voted Democrat who voted then for Donald Trump were not uneducated, right? They had a lot of them had a college education, post-grad education, and even the ones that didn't were entrepreneurs and businessmen and moved, products around the world. And so these aren't people that have no education in the system, but identity politics came for them, right? It came to them. They keep hearing about it, I think, in a way, especially the Democrat, the deplorable type, where I was raised to not think about race or think about gender. And I was like, okay, that's fine. We'll judge you solely on however you behave and how you engage with me and what you can produce for the world. but now we hear everywhere, it seems, is about our race and about our culture and about our 1619 moment and about how our whole institutions and everything is designed around race and oppression. So you can't really fault the white working class folks that get steamrolled through the China thing and then end up hearing about it in terms of race and then saying, okay, well, I'm white, he's white, we're white, and we're all having the same problem. So maybe it's a thing about white folks.
This goes back to the kind of Alex Jones taking him seriously but not literally sort of thing. Like they're grasping at some truth, but it's very easy to just dump on people who might be expressing their views in ways that is, frankly racist or xenophobic, not recognizing that you can acknowledge that and still acknowledge that they have some valid, legitimate grievances, and maybe addressing those grievances would preempt them from channeling that rage into these red herrings, right? So, I think there's a lot to this, to what we call identity politics, that actually isn't about identity. It's about labels, right? It's about so another way to think about this is what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor wrote about in his famous. He's written about multiculturalism and stuff like that, but it's a famous essay called "The Ethics of Authenticity," and his analysis is that we've moved through these phases of how we think about the individual, how we conceptualize the individual, the self, and in an earlier phase, we had honor societies where it's about sticking up for what's right, and if you just take something from my property, you dishonored yourself. We moved into the kind of classical liberal era where it's really about the individual in relation to the state and the liberties that they have, right? And now we've moved into post-60s an ethics of authenticity, where your individuality is defined by your ability to have self-expression and to realize your own unique butterfly aspect to yourself. And I think a lot of identity politics, especially in sex and gender, is a manifestation of that conception of the self as one's total uniqueness and inherent self-worth via that authenticity to your uniqueness. And where I think that's problematic is the way it misses the more communitarian aspects of our identity, right? It's not just that I am Canadian, it's that I belong to a thing called Canada, right? Like, and that belonging to a larger group is these more corporate identities is, I think, what's really missing today, where we think about everything in such an individualistic way that we miss the ways in which our identities are formed in collectives, and not simply because I am part of the alphabet soup, or or this or that or that ethnicity, and even something like intersectionality is kind of like the step beyond. Once you are defining individuality as your own authentic self-expression, the next obvious next step is to subdivide that identity such that, like, you would think that the individual was like the bottom. We get to from many to one, but actually you can subdivide that one into even more. And I think this is all in a weird way, hyper individualistic. And this, I think, also goes to my point about like how a lot of this is derived from Protestantism, because one of the whole point of the Protestant Reformation is to say, I am in a position to interpret God's word, and I don't need you to interpret it for me,
right?
And because I have a level of authenticity, and able to form my identity individually, right? And these modern manifestations of it are just sort of a next stage in the evolution.
Jonathan Haidt is somebody that I think that you respect. You cite him and talk about his books quite a bit, and I think he's argued that we went from an honor culture to a victim culture. How does that jive with what you're talking about? A victim culture, which is, I no longer resolve my conflicts, I appeal to authority, etc.
No, I think that's I wouldn't put that in that way because I think it's a loaded term. But because again, I'm not trying to make a polemical point. Like I don't write about culture really at all. These are just my own personal
we're
beliefs.
Just having a conversation.
Yeah, but I think the quote unquote victim culture is a symptom of the deeper ethics of authenticity that I'm describing, where in the prior age, like the classical liberal, you're an individual insofar as you have equality under the law and you have these liberties. That defined human dignity and respect for human dignity as a kind of relationship, a kind of institutional relationship with the state and with your own personal liberty. In an age of authenticity, human dignity becomes defined as recognition. Do you recognize that I'm a special butterfly? And if you are lacking that recognition, even if you have basic liberties and so on, then in some ways you are being maltreated, right? And I think a lot of what identity politics, the bad form of identity politics, is a kind of you must recognize me, damn it, right? It's not just tolerance, it's acceptance and even in celebration, which in many cases might be really good and positive, but it leads to a political impasse, right? Because you can't force anyone to recognize things that they don't want to recognize.
Right. There's a lot of political impasses,
and even like the so-called white working class, like a lot of that, is a crying out for recognition. Like if you feel like the political system hasn't acknowledged your existence, you've lost that sort of mutual recognition that is fundamental to, what civilization politics is, right? Like this is a deeply Hegelian point, right? Like the master-slave dialectic is one in which the master comes to recognize himself in the slave, and the slave recognizes himself in the master, and that's what leads to the abolition of slavery, is this recognition of mutual sort of a level of social equality. But if we're not talking about master and slave, instead something totally unique and intersectional, idiosyncratic between the two people or the two groups, then it's not clear how you produce a synthesis or how those two things merge.
What is the synthesis between the elites and the working class? What synthesis happens there?
In this case, I don't think the issue is synthesis. The issue is settlement, right? To have some
settlement.
Yeah, like political settlement. Like
right.
There has to be institutions in which disenfranchised working class people of all backgrounds can have a seat at the table, right? And one of the other big issues that's driving this is just the decline of religion, right? Like the Trump's base, they might be identify as Christian, but they have some of the lowest participation rates of in history for American Christians.
Is that specific to Trump's base or just specific to Christianity in general at the moment?
In general,
yeah.
Yes. But there is this kind of secularization on two levels: on the level of what people believe and what they say on surveys, and on the level of just the crumbling of community and participation. And to the extent that culture is empty or void without some objective instantiation in the world, without a religion that doesn't have a congregation isn't really a religion. It just becomes it just becomes hollow, right? The culture, a Christian culture, isn't really a culture unless it's embodied in some physical form. And so the paradox, not the paradox, but one of the impasses is this fact that you do have people who have religious beliefs, but they have no way of channeling that into or mobilizing that into any kind of power, because they are like a man on an island, right?
Yeah. Very interesting interplay between the church, congregation, Christianity itself, our culture, identity politics, world trade, global trade, class mobility, identity, all of it right now. And I was bar mitzvahed and I celebrated Christmas. I grew up as a Jew and a Catholic, but I didn't take either one of those into adulthood. And I never really claimed to be like an hardcore militant atheist. I always thought it was very difficult to explain, so I was skeptical. But I have to say, in the last year or two, in seeing what's happened, what's happening in America as we remove certain guardrails and certain the non-political institutions in the country, leaving seemingly like a gaping hole that was once filled by the church, I can see much more today the value. And the more I learn just about science and space and time and technology and everything, I become even a little bit more and more attracted to the notion of some sort of faith.
But this is another way where like identity matters, and having multiple identities matters, right? Like the hyphenated part of the Canadian identity is like being a Canadian means I watch hockey and and I'm afraid of moose, but it also means I have all these thicker identities. So like where I grew up in Nova Scotia, it's majority by far a white population, but we don't, like, you can tell by people's last name whether they're German or Scottish or French. There's even schools that teach Gaelic, right? So there's still robust sort of segmented communities there, in a way that they haven't like totally assimilated into a Borg. So I think that institutions matter in this context because they're what provide like the binding, the glue, the adhesive that keep these identities together. And when you have multiple identities, and identities that are defined in terms of a group, not just your own authenticity, then they also are useful for cognitively, right? They make it easier to go left when everyone else is going right. To give you an example, so with by far the most free-thinking, Trump ambivalent part of the Republican coalition right now are Utahns, right? And it's partly because they are not just Republican, they're not just conservative, they're also Mormon, and they have that splintered identity, and that the institutions around that, the strength of the LDS Church, it provides them, it gives them traction to actually be freer thinkers in some sense, right?
Right. Well, do we not have examples where we have imported, or we, United States, have exported political systems and tried to map them onto different cultures? And how has that worked out? And in studying that, would we not be able then to understand what would happen if you imported a population into a political structure and how that would work out? Do you follow me?
Yeah, if they're a mirror image of each other.
Yeah, or what pulls, what creates which creates which. I mean, has it worked for the United States to export its version of politics?
Yeah, so in the China Shock paper.
Hey, we made it back.
We made it back. Well, I think this is all related, right? Because really the China Shock doctrine, what it's saying is there's the gap between theory and practice, right? And in the last section, I give the kind of dichotomy between this debate in economics between the Austrian school and the historical school. Like this is where the emergence of the Austrian school of economics came from, where the historicists, largely German, they maintain that history and context and path dependency are our starting points. We start by looking at reality and seeing how it's embedded in history, and then make institutional reforms that way. Whereas the Austrians, with Karl Menger and Ludwig von Mises and those guys, like they were a kind of positivism, in the sense that the school emerged because they rejected the historical school and said, no, there are these universal laws to economics. Demand curves slope down, supply curves slope up, and humans act purposefully, and like these axiomatic laws of economics.
perfect information also.
Well, yeah, that's sort of the neoclassical version of it, and there's truth to that. That's theory, right? That's theory is when you take something you see in reality, like something in practice, and abstract it, right, and make it so it's decontextualized, right? And theory can be very useful, because if something over here is related to something over here, if you have a theory that explains the one, maybe it also explains the other, right? But to the extent that that positivistic theory first view became sort of the norm in neoclassical economics more generally, then you end up in a situation where you feel like it's easy to just go into Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union and impose a schema that in principle or in theory is like the optimal way to structure an economy. And instead what ended up happening is, Jeffrey Sachs and the Harvard boys go into Russia, they privatize, they lift price controls, they open the country up to foreign investment, et cetera, et cetera. The industrial base collapses, much of it scattered around the hinterland in a way that didn't make much economic sense because it was the product of central planning. That all collapses. You end up having, an alcohol epidemic because they privatized the state liquor monopoly, and people's life expectancy declines radically. And over time, you end up having this backlash to globalization and support for an authoritarian in Putin, who is not just an authoritarian, but somebody whose modus operandi is to try to build a new historical myth of Russia, right? To say that, no, we are products of our Eastern Orthodox history, and that's where he gets his foothold by re-injecting history, as opposed to these just purely theoretical free market types that used to run the country. And the point of this is that, like, shock therapy, as it's called, like going into a place and radically reforming it, is not an indictment of the model. Like, the model might work somewhere else, but you can't just take Hong Kong's model and put it onto Indonesia because Indonesia has a totally different path-dependent history. And where this is maybe different from the immigration argument about, like, if we import people, we import their culture, is it's less about culture than it is about institutions, right? So, if you're in India or Indonesia, there's going to be a large informal economy. Maybe it has, it doesn't have normal legal system, but maybe it has, pseudo legal systems. They have different institutions that regulate commerce, and you can't just come and blow that up. But if someone from Indonesia comes to the United States, it's not that they're bringing their culture, of course, but they're not bringing the institutional scaffolding that culture lives on. And so I think the worries that if we import a bunch of Indians, we're going to get Indian institutions, or what have you, or Mexicans, we're going to get Mexican institutions, is way, way overblown, and also just doesn't, empirically doesn't hold up.
It's interesting. I've heard the institution argument consistently beat over my head a million billion times while I was at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and we're talking about the same sort of shock therapy treatments that were given to various states in emerging markets, Latin America as well. And the key to their success was always, we got to have institutions, got to have institutions, got to have institutions. But the institutions come from somewhere, and they come from the people, and they come from the history.
Yes.
That's why they're called institutions. That's why they're called institutions. And you can't create them. Right.
You can if you are Pinochet, right? Like, right. And this is why the model, like, it kind of presumes a kind of dictator, right?
Right. It requires it almost.
Right. And so that's another reason why it's problematic. But that doesn't mean that reform's not possible. It just has to be endogenous. It has to come at some level from within. You can have outside support, but if you impose the theory without trying to shape the practice at the same time, then you get this disjoint, right? And that disjoint means that the theory doesn't actually work the way you think it does.
Right. I do like the way that at the end of the piece you did talk about the difference between the Austrians and the historicists, and you said, am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. Historicists. And it was really the difference between whether or not something's going to work in my little textbook, or we can look towards history, see what worked, and then try to work with that to improve it and to move things along. I think you had a graph in there, or I saw somewhere where it's, sort of like the squiggly upward sloping line that bounces up against the guardrails of institutions and history, and what you call it, path dependent. I guess.
Path dependency.
Yeah,
history matters, and it matters not just it matters to our norms as well. Like our norms are products of history. They evolve. Like morality evolves. It doesn't necessarily bend towards justice or something like that. Like that's a backwards reconstruction of what's happened. But but like to the extent that America had much different cultural attitudes in the 50s and 60s, then in the present we look across the sea and see countries where their cultural attitudes are even more retrograde than the 50s and 60s.
Right.
Then we demand them to, why isn't gay marriage legal in China? Well, like America, you only got legal gay marriage, like after Oberfeld, like it's just happened. Like,
right.
Come on, like you can't force this normative change, because normative change, like moral change, is something that lives in the people and lives in the culture and lives not as an individual, but in the group, in the peers, in the way that the norms get embodied in actual rules.
Right. So, I mean, I know that you just dismissed this argument, but it seems to me that in that model you just presented there, that if the inputs change, then the outputs would change too, right? If your input of your people into your communities, then your norms change, and then ultimately your institutions change. And look, I am only exploring these issues. Like I said, I was raised to believe, totally open-minded. I don't see race, don't see gender, whatever you perform. If you fit into our American, dream or vision, then it's all good, and let's all just work hard and stuff. And it's only just in these last 5 or 10 years where you just get beat over the head with race and culture so many times that you have to start taking a look at it from the other perspective. And again, I'm reluctantly having these conversations, but they're out there, and they're like being forced on us. And so I'm trying to explore each of these various avenues
in the same way that the Paul Krugman trade strategy of hiding the nuance backfired, and ended up giving the ammunition to the barbarians. Like when certain topics are off, when certain things are off topic, or you're not allowed to talk about them, then it's only the barbarians who are going to talk about them, right?
Right. I think you just called me a barbarian.
Well, no, there's a spectrum.
I'm on it.
I think Steven Pinker made this point about the alt-right, which is like, if we can't talk about group differences in genetics, or gender differences, if there's some elite taboo around that topic, then when people go to college and hear this, and then they're like, that's insane, and they go back to their computer and they go on YouTube, and they're going to find the most polar opposite interpretation of the facts, and when discussion gets shut down, or when things get off topic, or closed,
right,
whether it be about trade and globalization, or about race, identity, gender, etc., then I think that actually ends up contributing to polarization, right? Because you have the official narrative, and then you have the counter culture that feels in some way that they're lied to, and then end up adopting like the most radical mirror image of what they've been told.
Right. You probably consider me to be some sort of radical, but I'm coming at it.
I think of you as a moderate.
As a moderate.
Yeah.
I'm coming at this from I don't know if I hesitate to use words that have actual meaning beyond casual use, but like as a reaction to things like, I'm focused mostly on gender and gender identity and roles, right? Masculinity and femininity. And the reason why is evidenced by things like the American Psychological Association coming out last year and basically saying that all characteristics that make up men are toxic and are pathologized and need to be, treated out of the population. So like that's a very concrete example of our institutions that feed into our professional and healthcare system that are going to have a very direct effect on people that I think is going to be negative. So,
yeah, I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that people like Jonathan Haidt, who make some of these same points, they have more power, more social influence, and a healthier kind of social influence than the men's rights activist who who sees misandry and becomes misogynist, right? Like.
Well, to be anti-misandry does not necessarily make you a misogynist. Let's just make that point.
No, exactly. That's my whole point. Like,
yeah. Well, there's a lot of issues, and we've been at this for about 90 minutes, and there's certain elements of the China shock thing I really want to get to.
Do another 90.
So I'm all for it. So let's circle back to the China thing. So 1990s. China gets there's a big push from everybody in the United States and the world to get China into the World Trade Organization and normalize trade relations with them, which means we can send products back and forth. And of course, all the businessmen and the politicians in their pocket were just chomping at the bit to get into that big giant market and sell all of their cars and everything over there in China. And nobody told regular Americans what was going to happen. And we ended up getting a carving out of the Rust Belt and other industrial areas that, you can look at the map, the last electoral map, and you can basically see where it was, right? It was the degradation of Hillary's blue wall. And Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Those three states really helped turn the election for him on a very small, thin margin.
No, it was the FBI.
70. Oh, are you being serious? I don't know. We don't know each other just yet. So, 77,000 votes across those states really turned everything. And all this was based on this notion of comparative advantage. And I remember being taught as a kid in economics. I have a degree in economics. Comparative advantage was like the foundation for all of our trade policies and for all the reasons why we should trade. Maybe you could just explain what it is and then explain how maybe in whatever your take is, I think I have an idea on how it actually translates into the real world and the pros and the cons and what had happened. And maybe you can couch it in terms of race to the bottom and these sort of things that they're also thrown out there during the protests as well too.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to explain comparative advantage is with a more micro example. So, you learn about this in trade books when they talk about wine and butter, guns and butter or whatever. But a better example or easier to grasp example might be a lawyer and his secretary or her secretary, or their secretary.
Check the bio to make sure.
So a lawyer might be it's obviously good at lawyering, but might be even better. Might be better than any secretary, like at being a secretary. Like they can answer the phone like no one's business. But it still makes sense for them to hire a secretary because specializing and just focusing on being a lawyer is their highest value activity, right? And so, and they in the lingo they have an absolute advantage in both secretarying and lawyering, but they have a comparative advantage in being a lawyer. And so comparative advantage describes the theory of specialization in trade. So the lawyer specializes and then hires a secretary who specializes in being a secretary, right? And that ends up being ends up creating gains from trade that exceed what's possible if they both try to just do things all on their own.
Right. And this is like foundational theory. This is like bedrock stuff that all trade theory is based on, right?
Yeah, and it goes back to David Ricardo, who's a classical economist. It's been around for 200 years. So it's and at some level it is kind of just common sense, right? Like I don't try to make I don't make my own bread. I get the bread from the baker, right? Because the baker specializes in making bread, right?
Right.
And at the level of international trade, there's similar patterns. Like I get my T-shirts imported from Bangladesh because they have a labor-intensive economy. They're lower wage, and so if there's a labor-intensive process, they can specialize in that and do it at lower cost than they could if me, a economist, tried to start a cotton mill or
Right.
and so at the level of international trade, we often talk about sort of factor intensity, factor abundance, right? So like America is abundant in high skill labor, Bangladesh is abundant in low skill labor, and so they should do the things that don't require a lot of skills, but maybe require a lot of just raw labor input, and we should do the things that are more capital intensive. I press a button and the robot does the job for me, or are more knowledge intensive that require years of education. And that's the basic theory behind comparative advantage.
Right. That sounds all groovy. Sounds like perfect. Hey, we should just, follow that everywhere and go exactly wherever it leads, right?
Well, the way I've put this before is the main, it's not that comparative advantage is false, it's that it's static, right? So econ, there are different conclusions in economic models if they're a static model or a dynamic model, meaning that they have time as a variable. And static, as a static model, of course, if I'm, I should hire a secretary, and the secretary should specialize in being a secretary. But what if that secretary wants to become a lawyer herself one day, right? Then you start off being a secretary, but you go to night school and you train you build new skills, you build new competencies until you have a comparative advantage in being a lawyer, right? And so when you introduce the time dimension, suddenly things change. So in the case of America and Bangladesh, when Bangladesh liberalized and they followed the kind of World Bank neoliberal advice, they specialized in labor-intensive, low-skill labor, and at first it was a success. Like their GDP took off. They've had declines in poverty and so on. But at the same time, by specializing in things that are labor-intensive, the binding factor there is wages. Mm-hmm. And if you specialize in being a low-wage country, it's hard to stop being a low-wage country, right? Like, and so to this day, even though they'd had takeoff growth, Bangladesh and China began liberalizing around the same time. But today, Bangladesh's GDP per capita is a third of that of China's.
Right.
And the reason is because when it comes to economic development of whole countries, you actually don't want specialization at all. What you want is diversification, right? And diversification, linguistically, is the opposite of specialization.
Right. So what does comparative advantage in the context of China and the World Trade Organization and free trade, free capital, free people, what does that do? What does specialization do to the United States?
So the flip side of low-wage countries specializing in labor-intensive goods is that we have increasingly specialized in knowledge-intensive goods. So we call this knowledge workers, or the creative class. And that trend has coincided with the rising premium for college education, the clustering of college-educated people into a handful of superstar cities that are integrated globally, the escalating rents in those cities, and the relative neglect of people with lower down the human capital scale, right? So the way I put it in the piece is that human capital, we think of it in economics. We measure human capital just by like years of education, right? But that's a proxy. Like years of education, it makes it seem like human capital is a linear spectrum from low skill to high skill. In fact, human capital is as diverse as physical capital, right? Like a factory is a different kind of capital than a computer, and we can't just call both capital K, and we have to disaggregate. And in the case of human capital, a plumber and an electrician might fit in the exact same middle skill or middle high skill bracket, but they have incredibly different kinds of human capital. An electrician can't do the job of a plumber, and vice versa, right? And so recognizing that heterogeneity, I think is incredibly important because, and I think that's also important from like the perspective of pluralism that I've been talking about. Like we need an economy that is diversified enough that it captures, that it maximizes not just GDP, but human potential more generally, right? Like,
Wait, an economist that just said we shouldn't focus on GDP? That's amazing.
No, we should focus on GDP in a sense, but what I'm arguing is that actually when you take this dynamical perspective, a perspective when you add time and you add heterogeneity, it's actually GDP maximizing to focus on those other people. So
As a consequence, not
right,
a goal.
Yeah, exactly. To focus on diversification in the exact same way that the lack of diversification of Bangladesh means they are still stuck in that sweatshop call center equilibrium. Like
Right.
they could be richer, they could have higher GDP. But they're maximizing a function that doesn't have time in it, right? And that's the problem.
Right. And so in the United States, what we did is we exported low skilled jobs, but then we also began to do something else. We began to export like medium, right? You were saying in this piece that we have lost our ability to complete the sort of manufacturing chain.
Right.
And there's actual really severe and significant consequences of that, right?
Right. So, the expectation with trade liberalization of China it was going to be like Bangladesh all over again, right? Like we're going to since the the 90s we've been importing cheap toys. That's great. Like more the merrier. We're not going to make our plastic toys. The issue is once China had the certainty that they're going to be in the WTO, they began engaging in development policy, like industrial policy. They made massive investments in their export sector. They not just stole technology, but learned.
Right.
Forget about whether it's theft or not. They tried to learn what other countries were doing.
Sure, they send him to be the head of departments at Harvard, and then have them. Did you hear about this? I mean, the guy who was the head of a department at Harvard just got arrested for Chinese espionage. So,
well, I'm not even talking about.
I know. I'm just throwing out a tangent there.
And this is something that every country has done in history. So
Sure,
America during the Industrial Revolution, and I write about this in the piece as well. A guy went over to Britain, studied their textile factories, committed it to memory. Right, he didn't have the ability to actually write anything down. But he understood how their cotton mills worked and so on, and came back to America and created the Boston Manufacturing Company, which still exists. Right, and so like learning by doing is not immoral. It's not wrong. Every country should do it because we want every country to be rich. Right, but what we've done, what the United States has done, is for years we sort of had a kind of Straussian relationship with free trade, where we said the right thing to do is liberalize and have a laissez-faire economy, right? Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, we have DARPA and the NIH and agricultural subsidies, and so we were hypocrites, right? But we kind of ended up drinking our own Kool-Aid and forgot that we were being Straussian that whole time, and ended up applying that sort of World Bank neoliberal doctrine on ourselves, right? And the consequences of that are when a country like China doesn't follow that rule book and tries to invest in its human capital and build new skills and new comparative advantages, they go from that labor intensive thing to middle skill jobs that are competitive with what the United States is exporting, right?
And so what you saw, I think it was in the piece, and you can please talk about it, is like one of the key elements that we have lost is not just a guy on the factory floor doing rivets, but actually higher up the value chain in machine tooling and small manufacturing, things like that. That then, by not having this ecosystem of engineers, workers, manufacturers, and the design all in the same sort of place with the same language and working together and iterating together, that we've had a severe loss in innovation.
Yeah, and a lot of wasted human potential, right? Because it was called, it is called, like in MBA textbooks and stuff like that, the open innovation model, right? And the idea behind the open innovation model is kind of captured when you look at your iPhone box and it says, designed in America, manufactured in China, right? The idea is, America is going to specialize in the hard stuff. We're going to do the R&D. We're going to do the design, the marketing, and when it comes to fabricating, Foxconn can do that for us, right? So we do the innovation, they do the fabrication. The fallacy behind that is that actually a lot of technology, a lot of innovation isn't captured in R&D, right? Like the cost of solar panels has been falling exponentially, not because they're spending a lot of money on R&D. They're spending less than 1% on R&D. It's because as you scale a business, as you scale an industry, you learn things just by doing it, right? Like you learn that there's a different way I can organize this production line that actually gets efficiencies, and actually I don't need that mineral to in the photocell. I can substitute that with something else, and that drives down costs and is a form of innovation, a really critical form of innovation. But you learn those, you discover those innovations by actually engaging in the production process itself, right? And so you have these. Apple is a bit of an exception because Apple makes it a point to be very embedded with its suppliers, right? So there's a very direct line of communication with Apple and its foreign suppliers where they are trying to avoid these problems. But the fact that they have to do all this work to avoid it is sort of a testament that it is a problem. Because if you are instead you design something for Kickstarter and then you go in Alibaba and find a manufacturer in China that will build it for you, you get back something that looks nothing like what you wanted. and,
Right.
And then if you want to fix it, you have to actually work through translators, and that level of segmentation is really destructive to the technology cycle. And it's not that we are trying to prevent China from becoming rich. It's more that for trade to be actually, positive sum, win-win, China can we can invest in ourselves and China can invest in themselves, and we can actually both come out ahead. But if we are unilaterally saying no, we're not going to do anything, while another country engages in aggressive industrial policy, then that's essentially like laying in the fetal position while you're being beat up.
And that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, and going back to what I said at sort of the beginning of the podcast, it's also just bad. It's not an indictment of globalization per se. It's an indictment of a particular approach to globalization that only captured half the benefits, right? It captured the benefits of the thing that the other country was selling, but didn't capture the benefits of how that competition could actually allow us to move workers into even higher productivity fields. In the same way that we moved workers from agriculture to manufacturing, we can take workers that were once making furniture, and they have a lot of tacit knowledge, a lot of skills that are not explicit, that are like like a basketball player has skill, but you can't write it down. We could have repurposed that knowledge in some way to do something even more high value, but instead that person is a Walmart greeter or on disability, and that means that in a sense we only get half the benefits because in the process of that disruption, we miss out on the creative side, right? Like what Joseph Schumpeter called it, creative destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And creative destruction is absolutely essential to a dynamic economy, but we didn't.
It's not to having a nice life in Pennsylvania.
Well, no, I think that's why that isn't really creative destruction. That's just destruction, right? Like
Okay.
that's the point. That's the point I'm trying to make is, Germany had a smaller version of the China shock. Denmark did as well. Very open economies. But what did they do? Well, because German workers are, in trade organizations and have a lot of bargaining power, their job just didn't get offshored, and they were, tossed to the curb. Instead, they work within the company to develop a new product line that maybe China doesn't know how to do yet, or is even more high value, more precision manufacturing. And then you still get the benefits of globalization. China can still produce things at a lower cost than they can, but at the same time, they're moving their workers and human capital into even a higher level of self-actualization.
So again, the elites back in the 90s, they failed. They failed to just put this type of thinking into the conversation. There wasn't adequate resources allocated to helping people shift both industries or types of jobs or within the organizations themselves. It was just all thrown on the altar of free trade and open trade and let's get into that Chinese market and make some money. And irrespective of whatever you think the policy should be moving forward, I think that we can agree on what the impact has been. And the impact in many cases has led to urban-rural polarization, the diminishment of the sort of middle worker economy in favor of the creative info class economy. And to me, even as troubling or more so is the loss of innovation in very specific industries that have national security implications, right? Like, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, what is the U.S. capacity in war making or national security or defense? And has it been eroded as a result of this loss of innovation from the iterative process of the middle manufacturing and the creative class, et cetera?
Well, I think, absolutely. This is not, I'm not an expert on this issue at all, but you see this playing out now with, the one area of precision manufacturing the U.S. has retained, namely semiconductors, right? Semiconductors are the brains of everything. And the U.S. has a lock on that, right? Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley for a reason. The skill involved in creating semiconductors is a kind of machine tooling, precision manufacturing skill, the kind that we lost across other sectors of the economy to China. But semiconductors are kind of unique because for the same reason that the Huawei issue is kind of unique. It's one thing to import toys, another thing to import the network infrastructure for your the network and computing infrastructure for your economy. So I think that is one of the reasons why some of the biggest China hawks in the U.S. government are national security folks, right? And the people at Commerce who are sort of most in favor of a more assertive industrial policy see this through the lens of national security. Now, I think that the national security argument is true, but it's even without the national security argument, there would be a great case for more sort of public investment and quote unquote industrial policy.
Right. So for people who support Trump, or at least to get the general thrust of where he's coming from, I think the China ascension to WTO, hollowing out of the manufacturing class, the reduction in some of our national security capabilities around this, a lack of innovation, and the concentration of wealth and resources and opportunities in the cities, those cities then being interconnected globally, has created the new rural-urban divides. And then you add to that the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, total loss in faith and confidence in our financial industry, the government's ability to manage these types of crises. How are they going to respond? Who are they going to assist? Is it going to be saving AIG and Goldman Sachs, or is it going to be saving that lady that took out 3 trusts and a grant in order to buy her first home, who's now losing it? And I think these things sort of add up into people being very disgruntled with the way things are. And I read an article, I can't remember her name now, but she was identifying that the real class struggle that is going to have a permanent and lasting effect is actually the intra-elite competition. And the intra-elite competition is happening amongst the top 2% to the top, sort of 0.9 percentile of the economic sphere. And what's happening there is that this specialization that has come out of a result of our trade policies is that the two things that we're best at making these days are financial instruments that fund tech companies. So and a lot of those tech companies aren't even designed to actually do anything super productive in the long run. And so we've got this whole new economy of just people making paper and getting money to give to other guys to do things that aren't really helping anybody. And those people are capturing like an inordinate amount of the wealth and opportunity. And do you see any connection between that and all this stuff? Because I mean, I hate to lay it all on the
Right.
foot of WTO, but there does seem to be sort of a straight line that one can draw.
Yeah, and that's partly why I called it the China shock doctrine, because I think it was a it's not the sole cause of our woes, but it was a kind of epochal shift, right? A new era, right? And to the point about the intra-class war, someone like Michael Lind, he writes in a way that's very assertive and self-confident and hold no bar, but someone like Richard Reeves at Brookings writes about these exact same issues, albeit in a more mild-mannered way, but the way he describes this is the dream hoarders, right? The dream hoarders are not the 1% or the 0.1%. They're the really top 10%, the people who own their home and make sure it's zoned that no one else can move there, that have beefy 401ks and tax preferenced college savings accounts for their kids, the people that are assortatively mating with other people from their college class, and preach the gospel of equality, but are themselves doing everything to make sure that they pull the ladder up behind them, right?
Right.
And that is a very real thing. And I think you could call it the upper class, you could call it the dream hoarder class, you could call it the people who really benefit from the state and local tax deduction class, right? Like those people in many ways have more power in politics than the billionaires, right? Like the extent to which the current Democratic Congress has tried to repeal the cap on state and local tax deductions is really telling, right? Like it's something that their donor and voter base really wants, when no one in the bottom 90%, makes enough money and pays enough federal taxes to ever really benefit from the state and local tax deduction. And moreover, people like Jeff Bezos, they don't care at all. It's a drop in the bucket.
Right.
So it's that class, and they have the ability to live in sort of tacit denial of their class status.
Yes.
And that's part of what the interclass warfare is about. Is if we can shift the discussion to the billionaires, then we sort of remove the attention from us, right? Like, and in some cases this is very personal, because maybe you are in the same Harvard class as Mark Zuckerberg, right?
Right.
But you went into a career in nonprofit management or writing for a left-wing journalistic outlet or something like that, and you're pulling back $70,000 a year. Meanwhile, that guy that used to be in your class is one of the richest people in the world, and you're like, well, what gave him the right? How is he entitled to that? I'm doing something for my community. I'm working at
Right.
I'm working for Greenpeace or whatever. But that latter person is still in that upper. They're still incredibly privileged, right? Like,
Right.
And
so just keep that in mind, guys, when you hear people, the AOCs of the world being pressured into talking about the billionaires. It's really a distraction, isn't it?
Yeah, and I offered a kind of analysis of this in the context of other countries that have high marginal tax rates. So, a lot of people don't know this, but Sweden has more billionaires per capita than the United States. And if you break down, you can look at Swedish and American wealth inequality. Sweden has much higher levels of wealth inequality, and even probably similar or close to equal levels of income inequality as the United States, once you factor in the fact that everyone's hiding their income in Luxembourg, right? If you adjust for that. But Sweden still has a relative, they're more compressed than the United States. But the fact that they have high marginal tax rates, one of the functions that serves is to make it very hard to create a new wealthy elite, right? It's very hard to accumulate the wealth to displace the incumbent, right? And this is part of a bargain in Sweden. Sweden is a constitutional monarchy. They have a literal nobility, like a literal aristocracy, people with noble names and stuff like that, and they inhabit that top 10%, right? And having high marginal taxes isn't just about helping redistribute from the rich to the poor. It's also making it so if you have one great year where you made $5 million, 70% of the last 4 million gets taxed away. Well, that makes it harder for you to break into that noble class.
Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's mostly a bad thing, right? Because
I was going to say.
Earlier to our discussion about the kind of equality that matters. If you think the kind of equality that matters is the avoidance of a new aristocracy or a new caste system or something like that, then it matters less that people have more than others and more that there's the churn and turnover in the system,
right.
that people don't sort of settle down into their privilege and pass it on intergenerationally.
Right. All right. On that note, we're going to take a quick break for my advertisers, of which there are none, but we will be right back. And we're back. Okay. So all of that has just been fantastic. I think we actually covered a lot of the notes that I had. The China shock therapy piece. If you haven't read it, I've been pumping it out to my Twitter feed basically for months now, telling people not only to just read it, but actually to study it, because there's so much in there that we can learn from. And I think we covered a number of the topics within. There was a couple of other things I wanted to get to here before we start to wrap this up. I was listening to an interview with Tyler Cowen and Eric Weinstein the other day. And Tyler attributed a lack of innovation, perhaps, and dynamism in the American economy to what he called the femininization of the economy. Are you familiar with that argument that he's made?
I heard that podcast as well.
Oh, you did? Okay. Mm-hmm. What did you think? Okay. Well, we can back up. What did you think about that podcast in general? And then what do you think about that? Because I would have liked for Eric to really have drilled down a little bit deeper on that.
Yeah. I mean, I follow Tyler Cowen's work. I've been reading him since high school. I thought that was one of the better conversations he's had, just because I think it's owed to Eric Weinstein for being such a generative person himself that he can come up with interesting topics and lines of conversation that Tyler probably doesn't get into on a standard news interview or something. Yeah.
But what do you make of this sense that there's been a lack of innovation within the American economy? They didn't talk anything about the erosion of the supply chain as leading to that lack of innovation. In fact, they focused very narrowly on this idea of femininization. Do you even know what they mean by that? Because I actually didn't, and I was wondering if maybe you had a take on it, given your experience at George Mason, and no surprise that you've been a reader of Marginal Revolution for quite some time.
I think it's an inflammatory way of putting things, but I think I can try to explain what I think what he's getting at.
Yeah, please do.
So one of my honors thesis was on the economics of religion, right? And my thesis was that religious organizations are basically sort of pseudo social insurance providers, right? If you belong to a church, you have the community safety net that comes with that. And potentially the expansion of the welfare state, it crowds that out, right? One of the things I discovered in researching that is that there is a very stark gender difference in risk preference. Yes. Right? And this is kind of obvious that it's men who die in motorcycle crashes and are jumping out of planes,
right?
In general, right, and on average, to the extent that some of the trends over the last 30 years, cultural trends like the decline of sort of free range parenting, the fear of stranger danger, the kind of flight to safety, it's a kind of de-risking of society in some way, right? And that is one dimension in which you could describe that as a kind of feminization. I wouldn't put it in those terms because I don't think feminization is what I don't think the feminine part of it is what matters. It's for Tyler, he's very, my read of him is he's sort of he still has a kind of countercultural side to him growing up, in the 60s, that he values nonconformity, right? He values the out of the box thinker and being himself sort of meta-rational in a way that he doesn't get caught up in herd mentality, right? And applied to the economy, like Silicon Valley at its best was a place that rewards that kind of heterodox nonconformist mentality where everyone out east is saying X is the only way to do something. We're going to show them that it's not the only way to do something, right? And to the extent that is a driver of economic innovation, and also the willingness to take risks, the willingness to fail, the willingness to be disagreeable, in the Jordan Peterson would put it.
Yeah.
Like all those things are essential, and there has been this broader sort of de-risking. There's a great, I forget the name of the book.
He's looking around his office.
I forget the name of the book, but there's a book about by Mark Levinson about the U.S. economy since the 70s, and a lot of the a lot of the pathologies of our economy seem somehow connected to the oil shock in the 70s, right? And the oil shock was a very traumatic event. It shook up a lot of our institutions, but it also, I think, in some abstract sense, like moved America's risk preference, right? It made us feel like we were vulnerable, right? And it made us, make things like oil energy independence and stuff like that, or the expansion of sort of environmental regulation to de-risk the environment. It made all that stuff a higher priority, and it became less about JFK, we can go to the moon. Let's take big, bold risks. Let's think outside the box. Let's celebrate the eccentric, and became more about safety, right? And even in the sense of like consumer product safety, right?
Yeah.
And the kind of the kind of idiom is, if you are worried about minimizing the worst outcomes, you might accidentally cut off the best outcomes, right?
Correct. Yeah, and so I think that's what they were getting at, but didn't go so far. And Eric and Peter Thiel have had conversations about the lack of innovation in physics and other areas of science, and they both danced around this sort of topic. The de-risking is a very nice way of putting it. The feminization makes a little bit more sense to me and will to my audience, because we're very well versed in sort of the general gender differences in terms of risk preferences and aggression and competition and such. And I guess you can see it as its impact in the American economy, as you said, sometimes you have to be disagreeable to get things done. Sometimes you have to be aggressive. Sometimes you have to take risks. And there's then been a shift in the corporate America also too, as anyone who's engaged with an HR department can attest, away from de-risking everything and every interaction and every element of what's going on, without no regard to the actual product that you're supposed to be creating, or the bottom line. And I wonder what the real long-term effect of this would be. I don't know that people would argue against this, but the American ethos seem to have been masculine. Let's land on this country, land on this continent, take all these risks, go crazy, expand, build,
Genghis Khan.
Yeah, I suppose. And that energy propelled us forward. And that energy is being shifted around a little bit and towards the de-risking and feminization. And I wonder what the long-term implications of that would be.
What I'd add to that list is vulgarity, right? Like, Trump's locker room talk. Like, I think one of the things that appealed to or spoke to was a kind of masculine tolerance for vulgarity. Like, maybe men on their own don't brag about sexual assault, but they are, much less. They're impolite. Let's put it nicely, in a way that's jovial and friendly, and to some extent, like the secret sauce of America is that nonconformist culture is also a more vulgar culture, right? Like, there might be snooty Europeans who look down on us because we're not refined and genteel. But the fact that you could move to Manhattan, and in between getting people, 5 people flipping you off and, and saying, get out of here, I'm driving, like all that is actually that level of vulgarity and that level of sort of acceptance of like low trust, or navigating a less tight-knit, trustful environment is actually super conducive to innovation, but also assimilation, like the good kind of integration, because you could if you are Chinese, you can move to New York, and you didn't feel like you have to adopt some New York culture. You're all walking around flipping each other off. That's the United culture, and to some extent, you could think about like how Manhattan has turned into a shopping mall as another another form of feminization. That I still am reluctant to put it in those terms, because I feel like it's reifying something that you can describe in other ways. Like, I know there's the kind of order chaos Jungian stuff that has lots of truth to it. On the other hand, I don't think it necessarily advances, or I think you might end up losing. You can find lots of ways where feminization might fit, but if the theory isn't perfect, or if we're not getting the right term for it, then we might be missing some higher level description. That
maybe you need to embrace your sense of vulgarity there too. Then just go for
it.
That's there you go. That's how you find the answer sometimes. American vulgarity as a virtue of innovation. That's interesting. And I definitely use vulgarity as a signaling in my social media, or as a way just to be like, look, if this bothers you, then you need to go, because you're not going to be able to have some of the other conversations and such that we want to have too.
Right, and I think to the extent that the decline in vulgarity, or the acceptance of, or political correctness, whatever you want to call it, like, it is incredibly stifling. In the case of sort of science and academia, it's harder to be that eccentric, sort of crude professor. Like, I think a turning point in science and American scientific progress really was like the reprisal of James Watson, who helped discover the double helix structure of the DNA, right? Mm-hmm. And who harbored reactionary views about race, right?
Right.
And long after his academic career had peaked, like, you're never going to have another high like that in your academic career. Just last year, or maybe 2018, there's a New York Times wrote a massive sort of revisionist look at his life, just portraying him as as a despicable person. And I think that is, like, I don't. Do we care if Tesla was anti-Semite? I don't know if he was. I don't mean to defame the Tesla family, but like, at some level, like,
Henry Ford.
Right, Henry Ford, perfect example. Like, probably was. And there's difference if someone that's part of their, like, what their project is, but like, but like, to the extent that James Damore gets kicked out of Google because he writes pretty anodyne memo on gender differences in engineering and stuff like that, then like that has a chilling effect across broader willingness to deviate, right?
Or engage in science of all kinds, or discuss scientific ideas, or just look at where the data is taking us. And that whole James Damore Google Memo thing was huge for me and for people in my audience and in our world, because these were the issues that we had been talking about for years, right? And then all of a sudden a guy at Google actually puts it out there, and it's got, footnotes, and it's based in science, and it's very credible, and he just gets killed for it. And bigger than what had happened to him individually was what it revealed about Google and Google's culture, and about kicked us off thinking like, okay, well, how are those viewpoints working their way into the algorithms and into the search, into the information control and the information flow? And then it just was sort of a Pandora's box into just really exploring what information is being withheld and what information is blacklisted, and what can you talk about, what can't you talk about. And it's these sort of things where you're not allowed to discuss the basic generalized differences between genders that lead to things like toxic masculinity as being a pathology, and masculinity needs to be shamed and eradicated. And you combine that with the intersectional philosophy and social theory and critical race theory and such that says that all societies have been oppressive and all oppressors are male, and male power is masculinity, and you got to attack the root of male power if you want to have freedom for everybody. And so you start putting all this stuff together, and we start trying to create a new world view, and to sort of try to evolve what we all thought, what I thought was a very reasonable, rational, loving, empathetic view of the world in the 90s, carry that same view forward into 2020, and somehow I'm on the other side of this culture war. I'm a bad guy. I'm a bigot, racist. I've been called a racist. I've been called a Nazi. I got fired from my job for being called a Nazi because I wrote an essay questioning the sanity of sanctuary cities, and what does it mean for federalism, and what does it mean for our government, and the budgets in Montgomery County. I mean, I literally got fired for just talking about stuff like that. I mean, it's crazy. So there's a whole sea change afoot, and your China papers and some of your other writings also, I could weave them together as part of our story. When I say our, I mean my audience and such. In researching a variety of the things that you wrote, I saw that you had written a couple pieces for American Mind. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. So that's the Claremont sort of blog, or whatever journal, I guess. Sorry, guys, blog. I don't mean to diminish it, but they're a very interesting group, and I've been learning more about Claremont and their evolution in their thinking. What have you noticed out of them in terms of their change? Like the most recent sort of big statements I've been reading from them about is if they have basically decided that multiculturalism is an existential threat to the American Republic. And by multiculturalism, they don't mean having a bunch of people from different countries in their country. What they mean is identity politics, political correctness.
I wish we could just call it monoculturalism, because that's really what it is. Like, to the extent that culture really means like different beliefs. Yeah. It's not multiculturalism; it's monoculturalism, right?
Right.
And I know the Claremont people. I know some of them. I don't know always what they're up to, because they have a kind of esoteric way of writing, and I also don't. So this goes back to something I said very early on about America being sort of a host to more radical thought and a wider spectrum of thought, even amid this relative level of cultural homogenization. And so I don't know like where they fall on that spectrum. It's sometimes, I have libertarian friends. I know people who work in Capitol Hill who are anarcho-capitalists, right? And they work for Republican offices, and they're not trying to privatize the government because they don't have that power. But it's still striking that the conservative movement is full of, and the progressive movement are full of their own respective kinds of radicals. The thing that makes me weary is that America, unlike Europe, is still has a very strong Christian movement, right? And more so than you see in other countries, there's openness to a kind of Christian radicalism or dominionalism, stuff like that. To the extent that there were people who wanted the Iraq War because they thought it would hasten the Iran War and thereby bring the the second coming of Christ because that's prophesied in Isaiah. That stuff like kind of weirds me out a little bit, and I don't always know how to interpret it because often it's wrapped around different arguments or not stated explicitly, right? In the case of Claremont, my impression of them, I know them as sort of the West Coast Straussians, right? Like they have a, but sometimes I find it hard to interpret because it's kind of contradictory, right? Like there's a version of the kind of Henry Jaffa West Coast Straussian stuff, which is like, the East Coast Straussians think there is no God, but we got to pretend there is a God. The West Coast Straussians are one level above that and say, well, actually there is a God, right? And actually that's the big secret, that actually there is a God, and part of that God's mission is like somehow bound up with American nationalism, and that nationalism has to hew to the Constitution, the founding vision of the Constitution, because something that we literally think that this was inspired by our Creator, and maybe we don't talk about that explicitly, but I think there's, in the same way that I feel like there's a risk from having theory to detach from practice, I see the same thing on the right. Constitutional originalists, even if they can make a good jurisprudential argument that that's the right way to apply a constitution, it would be a shock therapy of its own if we were overnight forced to go back to the interpretation of the Constitution from 1776. Like there's a lot has changed, so there's a level of social evolution, including in the way we interpret laws, and there's if your agenda is that, the same reason I reject like the kind of Grover Norquist agenda that we got to abolish the income tax, abolish the IRS, get us back to the pre-1913. I'm too much of a temperamental conservative to embrace those kind of they're kind of utopias. They're like backward-looking utopias, right? And
right.
I think they can often be as dangerous. What I love about what Claremont's doing now is, they're open to very different points of view, right?
My next question for you.
Yeah, you got Curtis Yarvin writing for them, and you got
Bronze Age
pervert, and there's. So I think like.
Have you read Bronze Age Mindset?
No.
Michael Anton didn't persuade you.
No, I don't know Anton. But take something like the Flight 93 election essay, right?
Right.
I don't know if that helps. Like
helps what?
I don't think framing every single election as existential turns down the heat. And there's right-wing accelerationists who think we don't want to turn down the heat. We want things to get worse before they get better, and we want the internal contradictions to multiply. And I don't think that works that well. For the same reason that it turns out that when you smash the state, you don't get anarcho-utopia. You end up getting Libya and Venezuela, right? Like there's a level of So I just don't quite know how to pin them down, and that sometimes it confuses me more than anything. And I know people there and I know people have written for them who I probably share 90% of my thought with, but then there are other people who make it sound like everything since 1913 is unconstitutional, and we got to deconstruct the administrative state. And in some ways, like NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, is less constitutional than ICE because, but it's like, well, actually, we still need a weather service, and I don't know, we're not getting rid of the administrative state. Like maybe we need to reform it. Maybe we need to bring back some level of, genuine executive power rather than the administrative state being a power unto itself. But that's very different from a view that says we got to roll this back, right? And so I never quite know how to place them. And then one of my deep philosophical views is that theory and practice can be reconciled, right? Like we don't have to live in esotericism and keep things hidden from people. And I feel like sometimes I feel like my big critique of the naive neoliberal free traders is also that a critique of their like implicit Straussianism, where they're trying to hide things. And I don't want people to hide the ball. Like I don't hide the ball for myself, and so I'm just left, scratching my head about what it is that what their actual project is, right?
Right. I think it's undergoing a state of transformation right now for sure. But they definitely came out with a number of pieces that outlined their new perspective on multiculturalism being the existential threat. And they compared our circumstances.
What does that mean? What's existential about it? Like
that carried forth, it would lead to the destruction of the republic.
But what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
What does?
I mean, I don't have their response on can.
I know there's a broad sort of stylized fact, right? That older populations are less conducive to civil unrest, right? Like one of the reasons the '60s was so tumultuous, where there were bombings every day and everything else, was in part because the baby boomers were at their most peak testosterone ages, right? And we're living in an aging society. If anything, I feel like things are mellowing out. Going back to some of the de-risking discussion. And I don't see destruction on our frontier. What I see is what I think is the pessimistic vision is stasis, right? That the things just don't really change that much, and that we continue having these same debates because there are political forces that make it impossible to, climb the mountain to a better equilibrium.
I would think that Claremont would say that this 2020 is like 1850s, and that it's about competing theories of justice, right? And their perspective is that the social justice left multicultural warriors, whatever you want to call them, have a theory of justice that is in conflict with the theory of justice that our nation was founded on. And that the Republicans at that time were the ones in charge of maintaining the union, and they are again today in charge of maintaining the union. And it is these same forces that just had to have a different system of justice for different people, and those are just fundamentally incompatible, I think, is the foundation of their argument. Yeah,
I mean, I don't know if you've read Chris Caldwell's new book, The Age of Entitlement.
I didn't get an advance copy, so
I read it because it was in the airport. So I didn't read it in depth, but his big critique, and it's a kind of conservative reactionary critique, is his thesis is that the Civil Rights era represents a kind of new constitution, and there's these parallel constitutions. Now, I am. As a Canadian, as someone who's outside the kind of American experience, who doesn't, in other countries we don't frame everything in terms of black and white, literally, like race relations, stuff like that. You have a different perspective on things, and it's even going back to this the lament of the nation and the Canada's constant anxiety about Americanization, right? In some ways, the race debate in America has become the metaphor for everything, right? Like, Canada has questions about its how to treat its indigenous population or integrating new immigrants, right? Those are big topics in Canada, but they're becoming now more and more framed in terms of race, the racialization, right? And whether a Sikh is integrating culturally it's not about race, right? It's a total wrong metaphor. Or the issues, the injustices that were felt by the indigenous community are not analogous to slavery, right? it's this. There's a weird thing where like, people in Australia not officially, but like they recognize MLK Day, right? And there's part of American cultural hegemony is how that has been that frame of reference, that way of that ontology, right, has been exported to other places of totally different cultures and frames of reference. And I think that is a big problem. I'm not sure it's an existential threat to the United States, though. Like, I think there is this tension between the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights as originally understood, and the Civil Rights Act, which changed, which created new vectors for new kinds of law that are kind of pseudo constitutional, but are upheld because of precedent. And for me, like, I think the best scenario, I think if you spend too much of your time focused on that, you might put off vibes that you're like a true reactionary, that you think that maybe black people shouldn't be allowed in my store and stuff like that. Whereas I think there is a version of that debate that tries to moderate it and say, look, there's a version of history where we acknowledge the unique and deep historical impact of slavery, but the goal should ultimately to aspire to be a kind of post-racial society, one where we don't need these special preferences, one where we don't need these sort of special pseudo-constitutional legal protections, and I think that would moderate things, because what you're basically saying is, look, we don't want to go back to Jim Crow. We want to become more like Canada or other countries that don't have the same history and therefore don't have this other extra constitutional framework that's sort of crudely pasted on top.
Right. Well, that book, last I looked, was like number one almost in all of Amazon, number one in politics, number one in government, number one in philosophy. I think it's going to be read by a ton of people. I mean, it just sold a ton of copies, I think. But I was familiar with the general argument, but I will definitely pick that up. I just want to ask you one more question before we go. What is your take on UBI, Universal Basic Income?
Overrated.
Overrated?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's it. That's all you got.
Yeah, I mean, so someone like Andrew Yang, if I could vote, I'd be in the Yang gang.
Okay,
but that's partly because I think that Yang's he has a broadly right diagnosis. Like, I think when he talks about automation, he's really talking about offshoring. So I quibble around the edges,
mm-hmm.
but I think his orientation is to say, let's transcend identity politics, because that's alienating, and he's able to do that in part because he is a Asian man, right?
Math star.
And to say, no, we're going to focus on economic issues, and we're going to focus on the future, right? Like, we're going to orient our agenda to the future, and part of his also, I think, is part of his agenda is sort of rebuilding American state capacity to actually do things, to respond to crises like the opioid epidemic, to innovate in new areas, and I think that is where the country needs to be focused. So I don't necessarily agree with the UBI as a specific policy, because I think A, it's too expensive, and B, it kind of misunderstands social insurance. Like, social insurance is about pooling risks. So if your house burns down, you get redistribution from people whose houses didn't burn down,
right?
That are in the same insurance pool as you.
Right.
And there's all kinds of things like that in social insurance. If you get unemployed and you have an unemployment insurance, it's not about a flat transfer. And in fact, like, you can't reduce everything to a flat transfer. That doesn't mean I'm not for things that are like UBI. For example, I do a lot of advocacy around child allowances.
Was going to be my last question.
Right. And I think that in that case, it's a child allowance is a bit different than UBI. Because if you think about it, the market doesn't care if you're a parent or not. You get the same wage for the same job, but you have an additional mouth to feed, right? And so there's a kind of market failure with parenting, because the economic system is is unaware of fertility even being a thing, right? And we have this biology that we can't actually overcome. Like, this is what humans are. Humans live, they have families and give birth and they die. That's what humans do. And going back to like the metaphor of like molding the institutions to the hand, your most fertile years are also relatively low income years.
Right.
Like your peak earnings are in your 40s and 50s. And so there's a gap between when you have the resources to actually start a family and when you're able to start a family. And
interesting.
And the fact that it's a child allowance is just a flat, sort of like a UBI for kids. That structure makes sense because you're basically creating an income stream for that extra dependent that you have.
Right. Well, if you started couching it as UBI for kids, I think it might get more traction, actually. It's not a bad way of putting it.
It's got a ton of traction.
Yeah, people would understand that. Okay, we have covered just a tremendous amount of ground here. I really appreciate how gracious you've been with your time. I won't take up any more of it, but I do hope that we could pick this up again sometime in the future. It's been, I was going to ask you at the very end, who would you vote for? And you already came out. You would say you would be in the Yang Gang.
Well, I know you got to go, but I wanted to just challenge you on why support Trump. Like, I understand so there's this thing called the fallacy of mood affiliation. I don't know if you've heard.
Fallacy of mood affiliation?
Right. So, like, for example, there's a pro-environmentalist mood. Like, I'm the kind of person I want to affiliate with that mood, that I'm for the environment. But, being against littering or being for more land conservation, totally different topic than carbon tax, right? Like, global climate change is a kind of collective action problem. Like, it requires some solution. You can be for a carbon tax, but not necessarily be for the Endangered Species Act, right? Like, right. So the mood, because there's a pro-environmentalist mood, is if you're for one, you tend to be for all the things in that mood, right? And I think there's, if nothing else, Trump sort of represents a kind of aesthetic, right? He's defined some kind of mood, right? And that mood comes with a lot of association-specific policies that all get lumped together. That I think many of them are in the right direction, and Trump himself is manifested because of a lot of the problems in society that we've been discussing.
Yes.
But that does not mean that just because I'm pro-environmental doesn't mean I have to line up behind Greta Thunberg, right? Like, there's a personality with specific policies that he's enacted that is in many ways totally in conflict with the kind of mood that he represents, which is this masculine, to use your terms, and this repudiation of the establishment and everything else. And you can be for all that, right? But still take exception with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or think that or think that that maybe he is corrupt or doing damage to international relations and stuff like that. Like, there's ways where you don't have to fall into the tribe mentality. You can try to stand out, and this is what I try to do, and this is maybe why I'm able to have these conversations, being someone who's relatively moderate and liberal with people on the left and the right, is because I try to reduce that propensity to just fall into these moods, and then that helps me sort of pick and choose in a way that might be more consistent, right?
Right. Well, you bring up a couple of questions. One would be, why did you support Trump in 2016 versus do you support Trump in 2020 versus do you agree with all of the policies and legislation that he's passed and enacted? Those are all different questions. In 2016, I'm more with the Anton crowd, Flight 93, that if Hillary Clinton had won, that there would be just an unrelenting march through our institutions of illiberal, anti-enlightenment, anti-reason, anti-rationality, anti-science thinking that's focused on a new morality and a new religion of intersectionality, which has at its core the white male as the oppressor, by definition, no questions, no qualifications, and that everything that's happened bad to everyone in the world, in the United States, is specifically related to the societies that the white man created and the oppression that comes through masculine power and the patriarchy. That philosophy and that religion, whether she knew it or not, she was dragging it across the finish line.
I understand that, but what you described is a kind of aesthetic disgust, right? Like you don't like that aesthetic, right? Like what are the actual things that she would do? She would maybe rejoin the TPP.
As a concrete example, maybe Title IX in enforcement would have been increased and expanded, and the civil rights of men on universities, campuses across the country would have been further abridged. And
has Trump done anything? Really?
Absolutely. One of the first things that Betsy DeVos did was rescind the Dear Colleague letter of 2011 for Title IX, and they put it open for public debate and discussion, which Obama and Biden did not do. They sent out that DCL in 2011 and in 2013 without any public debate or discussion whatsoever, which then in turn changed the face of American universities and colleges all across the country based on pseudoscience, activist surveys, and a bunch of other bullshit that created this whole sense of idea of rape culture and that all men are predators and yada, yada, yada.
But
so, I mean, those are very concrete policy actions that I was rooting for. In fact, that was one of my number one policies.
I think you can bring up a list of things that have changed. I just feel like adding them all up, it's really nothing has really changed that much. In some ways, I feel like Trump is he is conservative Inc., but with all the aesthetics of the anti-conservative.
I know he's become it. So I mean, I wouldn't be alone in being very critical of the fact that he's failed on a number of things. Right, Paul Ryan tax cuts, huge omnibus spending programs, the lack of follow through on a number of the issues. China, I think they just released the currency manipulating status.
Let me give you
off of them. So but hold on. There's a difference between why did you support Donald Trump in an election versus Hillary Clinton? That's one kind of question. The next question is do you think that he delivered on his promises? And the answer to that would be in many cases absolutely not. Right.
But I think he's done the opposite. I think he's
been co-opted by conservative Inc.
Not just co-opted, but some of his policies that are obviously his policies, including the trade war.
Yeah.
Have tangibly harmed the people that, the working class that we've been discussing.
It may have, but I would say in that regard, and I appreciate the challenge here, and I hate the fact that I do literally have to go soon, so I will cut this off in a little bit. But this whole conversation that we had around China shock doctrine is about a failed China strategy, grand strategy. And anything that we can do to start deviating, separating ourselves from that failed China strategy, I think is helpful. Has there been negative impacts from the tariffs on specific sectors in the American economy? Yes. Has it been a boon for others? Somebody in my extended family runs like a metal tubing, manufacturing plants all over the Midwest and around the world, and their business went through the roof. When there were some specific, tariffs put on place, because they were one of the few people who were able to take on the additional demand for their very specific manufacturing capability. And do I have all the details on exactly who was benefited from the tariffs and not? No, I don't. But do I appreciate a sense in taking a more antagonistic approach towards China, or at least beginning to understand that they have held an antagonistic approach towards us through this entire time, in which we've been operating as a very open liberal economy. They've been operating as almost a mercantilist economy from the old days. And what happens when those two kind of things interact with each other? Bad things happen, right? They end up acquiring all of the money. We owe them all the money. They have all of our manufacturing skills. They have all these things, all these bad things that we've talked about. And how do you get to reshaping that alignment without maybe taking some dramatic action? I mean, Trump was a weapon and a manifestation of energy and feeling that was bubbling up through the country. And I wrote a 300-page book all about this, an apology about why this happened.
No, I think this is the best argument for Trump strategically. Like someone like Slavoj Zizek supported Trump because he thought he'd be a means to a more radical left wing, right?
Okay.
There are different means to the end arguments, right? That's different than supporting the administration or the person himself, or and this is what I mean by mood affiliation. Like there's the kind of Peter Thiel argument, which I think is actually the probably the most defensible argument, which is like, there's all these forms of consensus in American politics that that Trump has usefully blown open, like asking, why do we let NATO countries free ride, or why are we letting this sort of neo-fascist authoritarian state take all our jobs? So he served a purpose in blowing open, what sometimes is called the horizons of possibility, like thinking beyond our horizon. So
Overton window or whatever.
Yeah, over the window, and there's truth to that. But then this is where the mood affiliation comes back in, and it's like, well, the people who argue that also don't think he should be impeached, and it's not that the arguments for impeachment are clear cut. It's that there's a grouping, a correlation between what you believe. Like, why should a Democrat believe in the estate tax and pro-choice? Like they have nothing to do with each other, but these moods cause people to group. And what I want to put out to your audience is just, you can try to step outside these dynamics, and that's what the genuine free thinking is. And I think, to the discussion we were having about the monoculturalism of the left, like what that really threatens is a kind of group mentality and the value of being an individual heterodox thinker. And there's versions of that who are Trump adjacent, who are. And I'm not saying in the kind of lame Ben Shapiro sense where I'm going to just call balls and strikes. That's BS. I'm talking about having a level of meta rationality, of being a little zen about things, right? And not trying to not inadvertently creating a kind of mirror image of the thing that you're critiquing, right?
Right. Well, we had this conversation, maybe it was before we started recording, but I understand that the power of the presidency is limited, and I understand that the nature of our government is to slow things down and to end up in some sort of gridlock. And that's great, because that means that if things are going to really change, that there has to be really far-reaching support for that kind of stuff. So I never thought that by electing Donald Trump were we going to all of a sudden have some massive radical shift in policy and everything all across the board, and then we're going to have Nazism and go to war and kill everybody. No, I didn't think any of that. What I wanted to do was change the conversation. And I wanted there to be very specific emphasis on things that I mentioned, like Title IX, for example. I mean, that is such a far-reaching and powerful just stroke of administrative action that Obama and Biden took, that was based on fake science, that has now rippled through every one of our other institutions, as those kids that were raised in that era are now working for Google and working for the New York Times, sitting on the board, the editorial board at the New York Times, people that make jokes about like kill all white men and all kinds of shit like that. It's everywhere, and it all started back in that same time period. That Title IX DCL changed so much because it ignited and it took the intersectionality model and religion, and it just expanded it, and it put it into every element of our universities. Okay, it's like you go to orientation and they're like, "What is your pronoun?" And the things that you say aren't to be judged by whether or not they're true, to be judged by the way that the recipient feels. And if you feel like anybody's harassing you, we have a secret hotline that you can call the Gestapo, and we'll come and get them kicked out of school. All that started right around there.
But do you think Trump, like on the cultural level, I think there's a plausible argument that Trump has reinforced that trend. He might have had some policy wins here or there through Betsy DeVos, but I think there's also a narrative that he's reinforced insofar as the people who are pushing, diversity and inclusion and equity sort of agendas at the campuses are able to now say, well, look, this is what we're talking about. Like, if we don't have this.
Yeah, but that's a poor argument to me about don't take action, because the people you're going to take action against are going to say, look, this is why we have to keep doing what we're doing.
No, I think you have to like model the reaction function, how people are going to behave, right? Like, what I think is, I don't think if Mitt Romney had been elected in 2016, right? I don't think CNN would have had that Democratic debate where everyone announced their pronouns, right? Like, there's a sense in which the negative partisanship, right? Negative partisanship means you end up supporting the opposite of what what your opponent supports. So all of a sudden, Democrats are pro-trade, pro-immigration, anti-Russia, like
Right.
that kind of mirroring has it. You can't, if you want to step outside like the system and analyze things rationally, you have to say, well, maybe let's say if you're anti-immigration, like if you're a restrictionist, maybe Trump wasn't the best person to have, not just because he didn't really pass any comprehensive immigration reform, but because, now all of a sudden when the Democrats get into power, they're going to have license to be open borders.
Right. Well, I think that's an interesting approach. I think it would take a very sophisticated, finessing voter to be able to predict into the future. 5 steps ahead. You're sort of talking about some sort of like 4D chess.
I don't think it has to be 4D chess. So like we're for at Niskanen, we advocate for a carbon tax. We try to get Republicans to endorse a carbon tax. Right. It's actually harmful. The Green New Deal is actually harmful because if you pair climate action with, a myriad list of progressive goals from job guarantees to universal health care, like you're coding that in a partisan way that makes it harder for us to get bipartisan support, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's something analogous with, a lot of the stuff that gets done in Congress, the things that actually pass are the things that no one's paying attention to,
right?
Because they haven't been coded.
Right. Well, to me, if I had to go back and change my support or reconsider 2016 all over again, absolute no-brainer. No question whatsoever. There's no way in hell I could have advocated for or supported a Hillary Clinton presidency. And there's no way I could do the same thing for a potential Joe Biden presidency. And while I do think that Bernie Sanders does get some of the populist talking points right, I don't know that I can put my support behind him either. So now we come up, I'm a pragmatic guy. So I'm like, all right, well, what is there to do? Could I, you had said that you would have voted for Gary Johnson in 2016. It's a joke because he's Canadian, and it's a joke anyway. But the point is
Jill Stein.
These types of protest votes, which is what they are, don't actually do anything. And you are in a position of power where you do generate scholarship.
Regular votes don't do anything either.
Well, of course, it is irrational to vote. We know this, right? Brian Kaplan beat me over the head with it when I was but just an undergrad, telling me how voting was a completely irrational activity to do because the expected outcome is 0 and the investment in order to do it is very high. So it's totally irrational. But somebody's got to do it, and
but I think there's a lesson here, which is, if your vote doesn't matter because there's so many people, you have to find your source of leverage, right? So in my work, I do a lot of advocacy. I work on the Hill. I work in intellectual debates, but those intellectual debates are ultimately about driving some kind of wedge that lets me get actual things done, right? So, my leverage is not about joining Team A or Team B, right? It's about trying to step outside that so I can actually navigate the coalitions that let me, pass legislation that has more impact than my vote, right?
Right.
It's weird that I can have meetings of senators, but I'm not allowed to vote, right?
Right.
And I think, in the general public, there's all kinds of ways you can find leverage.
Yeah. This is my leverage. This is my way.
No, and I totally agree with that. Like having a podcast doing media, that is a form of leverage. I just,
you think I'm wrong.
No, I think that, I think someone like Eric Weinstein is a model for how you can say, well, we're going to be heterodox, we're going to challenge things, but he's not on team red or blue.
No, well, Eric Weinstein is in the process of becoming MAGAfied. He just hasn't admitted it yet. And his very public transformation has been excruciating to watch because he's identified virtually all the same issues that we've identified.
But it's excruciating because you're saying he has similarity with you on mood, but he hasn't made the leap into the tribe, right? And that's
because he won't take that action. He won't take that. He still believes that you can reform the Democratic Party from the inside, and I don't see that as possible. Do you?
I mean, to the extent that the Democratic Party looks radically different than it did 10 years ago, it could look radically different than it does 10 years from now, right?
That is probably true.
The Tea Party radically changed the Republican Party. Before that, they're compassionate conservatism. These things, you got to be hesitant about just linear extrapolations.
Right. Right. Well, I have seen zero evidence to show that the Democratic Party of 2016 is any different on the trajectories that I care about in 2020. In fact, it's all negative, all red lights for me. The APA action, all red lights. When you're pathologizing masculinity and teaching parents that boys who take risks and are hyper competitive are bad and they need to be treated. These things are bad for America. It continues the feminization of the economy, the de-risking. And Trump represented a remasculinization of America, which I don't think is a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a good thing. And I think that that's mainly one of the reasons that I supported him and supported the general vibe, right? It was about a general vibe and about a possibility for opening up new conversations, new directions. Trump the president is totally different than Trump the candidate. I think a lot of people that voted for Trump or supported the Trump the candidate are sorely disappointed in a number of different ways. But I was less optimistic, I guess, or idealistic. I knew going in that he'd be severely limited, and if he wanted to do this over here, he's got to pass this budget bill over here, and if he wants, he has to play the game, man, and they are going to get to him, and that's just the nature of the system as far as I understand it. So I didn't have any revolutionary expectations. In fact, I wrote in my book that if he took action on Title IX, it would be all worth it to me. And he did. And I see that as a seminal event in American culture. And it hasn't, just making these simple changes or that they're proposed to Title IX DCL stuff is not going to remedy what has already been put into practice for 10 years. That's going to take some more time. And so at this point, man, I'm still 2020 Team Trump for sure. I see no other productive, viable outcomes that are going to get us to the place where I want to go. But again, I was a Democrat my whole life, so I'm very socially open-minded. You know, when gay marriage came off the table, that's when I opened up my mind to Republicans. Once that was settled law, as a proponent myself of gay marriage, when that was settled law, I was like, phew, that's one less thing I have to be worried about. And when Trump candidate and president has come out in high favor of marijuana or cannabis legalization, that's another thing that was off my table, right? Or off the list of things that specifically precluded me from participating in the Republican Party. And I would argue that a number of those social issues have already been decided. And so it's now we're able to sort of look at some other issues. And that's where I am. And I appreciate being challenged. And I really wish I did not have to go, but I seriously have to go get my son so we can take him to baseball. This has been almost 3 hours here, which I really appreciate. I'm going to have to chop this up into a couple. But seriously, thank you very much. I appreciate the pushback. I need it because, a lot of times I don't get that either from guests or from my own readers or listeners. So thank you. And thank you for this very winding, sprawling conversation that's covered a million different pieces of information. And I think has been enlightening for everyone. I know it has been for me. Can you tell my guys where they can find you? Like what's a good way to, on Twitter, what's your handle, etc.?
Twitter's Ham and Cheese.
Ham and Cheese, all one word?
Like the sandwich, yep.
Okay.
The stuff on manufacturing, economic development, that all goes up at strugglingregions.com.
Okay.
And then the Niskanen Center is sort of my home base.
Awesome.
So, and just searching Samuel Hammond, you can find a lot.
You can find a ton of shit because I know I got neck deep in Samuel Hammond's bylines over the last couple of weeks. There's a ton of them out there, and I find it very worthwhile and worth reading, which is why I wanted to come down here and talk to you. I like your approach. I love the way that you write. You're a fantastic writer. I have a little writer envy, and especially your ability to put everything into context historically, and to advance the conversations along their natural lines and to give context for everyone. I appreciate that. So,
the feeling's mutual. So.
Well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it, and hopefully we can do this again.
Agreed.
All right, thanks.